What Drives You is brought to you by Ziglar, your premier source for equipping life and leadership coaches. Visit Ziglar.com and let them inspire your true coaching performance.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Miller. This is the What Drives You podcast, where we focus on your drive. Your drive is working in some areas of your life, producing great success, yet in other areas, maybe not so much. Let's get clarity on what you value, what motives are helping and hurting you, and get you fully into alignment so you're driving further and faster and enjoying the ride. I state we are all driven by our desires or our fears, a little of both, positively or negatively. Well, in relationships, the same holds true, and it's explained and defined by our attachment styles. As a child, you experienced attachment to others a certain way, and this was your programming going forth for all relationships. It's daunting to think that what we learned how to relate as a little kid is really how we most enact our relationships today. Well, friends, this is immensely significant. I mean, you can quickly find out your attachment style and open a whole new world of understanding and opportunity for your life, from relationships to how you work, to how you perceive your spirituality, which we get into all those areas in this show. I sat down for a long talk with Taies Gibson. Taies has become the authority on attachment theory and styles. She's got a PhD. She's got nearly a decade of experience running a successful private practice and engaging with over 30,000 clients through individual sessions, workshops, and an educational platform. She created the Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, which unites traditional attachment theory, developmental psychology insights, and potent subconscious reprogramming techniques that are woven throughout the course material within the Personal Development School. Taies founded just that, the Personal Development School, when her private practice got fully booked with a 2-year waitlist. Well, it quickly expanded to thousands of members and counting in 115 countries. The school has over 38 million views on social media. I'd really encourage you to go check out YouTube. Type in Personal Development School. It's incredible, the wealth of information. You can learn really quickly about your attachment style. And on that note, I encourage you to go to personaldevelopmentschool.com right now. You can take a free attachment style quiz. That's what I did. I just took the free one, and that's what you'll hear us talking about in reference to me and my style, which is not one of the better ones in the show here. If you want to join her membership, she's got so many courses that you'll see over there. You can use code KEVIN25 and get 25% off. So Personal Development School, take the quiz. Again, I'm not getting paid a thing for this. This is something that I'm using for my life. Personaldevelopmentschool.com. Take the free quiz right there. And then if you do want to join her membership and get into the courses, use Kevin25. You'll get 25% off. And you might want to take the quiz before you even listen to the rest of the show so you can have a better understanding and integrate what you're about to hear right now. As up next, I talk with Taies Gibson. Okay, when you and I talked the first time, I got to talking about some book that I was reading, and you said, "Oh, I'm reading on that too." And I can't find my notes, and I couldn't remember what it was. And it was, I don't know if it was on attachment or if it was on, I've been reading the Money and the Power of Attraction by the Hicks, Anthony DeMello. I can't remember what
Anthony
it was.
DeMello, that's what it was. It was what's it called? The Way to Love. It's funny. I have that book like downstairs.
That's right. The little one.
Yeah,
that's right. Because I told you I gave it to all my family, which at Christmas time, there's like 10 or 12 of us. And I gave them all that little book, The Way to Love. What drew you to that? What got you onto reading that?
Before I was into anything personal development or relationship, I was really into spirituality and still am. I've always been on a bit of a spiritual path. And so my first book that I read, my first 2 books were, this is a long time ago now, like 14, 15 years ago almost. And my first book was The Mastery of Love by Don Miguel Ruiz. He also wrote The 4 Agreements. Yeah. And that shifted something in me. And then I was on a really spiritual path. And actually my business partner, a good friend of mine, I had given him The Mastery of Love, and also Michael Singer's book, The Surrender Experiment and the Untethered Soul. And he gave to me like a couple of years ago. He's like, "Oh, you have to check out this book. You'll really like it. You always give me these spiritual books." And that's just how I started reading it. But it's a beautiful book. And I find sometimes it's something I sometimes struggle with and have to really work on is I find that when we have these books that are like these profound works of art, when they're really simple, like they are in his work or in like Don Miguel Ruiz, like if you read the Four Agreements or the Master, like they're all very like so simple that they can just, it's almost like they pierce your consciousness a little bit in terms of how they affect you.
I agree. It's convicting because I think, well, why did they, my publisher wanted 60,000 words and I actually ended up with 70. I'm thinking, do we really need that many words? I can really explain drive a lot quicker than that. And also, but folks, go buy our books anyways. But it is, I mean, you can boil it down. Sometimes I feel like the intros in our books, they just you just got it right there. You don't really need to keep reading at this point. It helps it go in, but okay, well, that's we're recording. We're just going to run with it because that's my interest was, how do you get to the point now? I mean, I was, reading around doing my research on you, and you are often spoken of as, in essence, the authority on attachment theory. That's a big deal. What gets you going after that pursuit? Especially, so, I mean, here you are with spirituality, looking at that, and then you come out and you've now devoted yourself to attachment. What is it that drove you, to use the drive aspect, that drove you to go, oh, out of all these areas, out of spirituality, all the areas of counseling, whatever, attachment. Oh my gosh, what spawned that devotion?
I think from the earliest age, my curiosity about relationships came from my family. I think my parents had a really tough divorce. They really had there was a lot of chaos in the home. Like I have a great relationship to both of my parents and I like love them dearly and respect them so much. But I just think they brought out like the absolute worst in each other. And so they would have these huge kind of volcanic arguments and fights. And, they had this really long-standing divorce that went to like the Superior Court of Canada and all these things. And I think I always wondered as like a very sensitive child, just like, why does it have to be this way? Like, why does it have to be this difficult? Why does there have to be this much fighting or arguing when people like are loving and care about each other? And so I think from a really young age, I was interested in that. And then I internalized and definitely repressed a lot of those chaotic moments. And I think I didn't know how to process them and developed a lot of core wounds around like not being able to trust, not feeling safe, being vulnerable or opening up, and all these different things that really affected my attachment style. And then I started learning a lot about like the subconscious mind. So it's a very long story. I'll try to make it not too.
Well, I'm gonna jump around. I'm gonna kind of go back and forth because I want us all, me included, and the audience to hear about attachment, understand that as we're unpacking this. So I'm going to come back to you in a second. I did want to look at this and, again, on the aspect of drive, reading your material. And of course, I've got your book. You let me into your community. I did the quiz. And first off, I got to admit that at 53 years old, okay, in a lifetime in personal development, with a show. I mean, I am a practitioner, at this point. I mean, this is what I get paid for. I missed the boat on attachment. Somehow I never really got into relational attachment. My kids did before me. So when you came along, I was like, okay, I've got to get into this because my older kids are already talking about it. And it got me to thinking as I look at it. I mean, right now here, as I sit and as everybody's who's listening, I don't know if it's a fair question, but I almost want to ask how much of who we are is driven by our attachment style. Where would you ballpark it?
I would say as a statement, most things that are comprising our personality that are built from fear. So I think what happens is a lot of times we go through life and a lot of our original programming at a subconscious level comes between the ages of 0 to 8 because we're in basically a state of hypnosis. We're producing mostly alpha and theta brainwaves. We're hypersuggestible. And so basically between 0 and 8 years old, we are sponging up everything that we are seeing, everything that's modeled to us, all the things that we're hearing. We're in a hyper state of suggestibility. So a lot of the things that we develop as fears, so I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I'm unloved, I'm alone, I'll be abandoned, trapped, all these core wounds that we have. The vast majority of those things are rooted in our early childhood experiences. And those are big things that then shape our attachment style as a whole, which when we look at what comprises somebody's attachment style, you can think of your attachment style as being the subconscious set of rules that you learn about love. And so this means what we fear in love. This means what we need in relationships, right? Some people need acknowledgement, appreciation. Some people need validation and reassurance. Some people need novelty and growth. So our fears, our needs, what we tend to expect relationships to look like, how much time we spend with somebody, how much space we have, how often we talk to them or text with them, like all of these things come from our early subconscious roots of programming. And so we've got these core wounds, our needs, our expectations. A lot of how we emotionally regulate is developed in the early days of our attachment style. And then the way we treat our own boundaries and patterns of communication. And so many of these things form the relationship to ourselves, because the relationship that we have from our parents determines how we learn to treat ourselves. If we are criticized all the time, we're often the most critical in the relationship to ourselves. If we had a lot of intermittent reinforcement, we'll tend to intermittently reinforce ourselves. If our boundaries were violated, we violate our own boundaries. So we really take in so much of modeling for what relationships should look like, and that largely develops the relationship to ourselves. And then all the things that we seem to see and hope for and expect in relationships with others. And of course, all those things are huge parts of our personality.
Okay, let me ask, because as you talk, and I had this plan to ask anyways, it did get me questioning where you are in relation to attachment theory with nature versus nurture. Bottom line. I mean, I've got 9 kids.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I got 9 kids, seven by birth. So 7 that I, saw from the from the beginning, the very beginning. And I have always been very much advocating on the nurture side. Of course, I want to believe that we can just be and make and become whatever we want to be. And I do believe that. But then now having these kids, I can't deny the fact that, oh my gosh, they popped out really different. Very different personalities, tendencies. And I want to say even growing up in the same home, but to have that many kids. I mean, my oldest is 28 and my youngest biological is 13. I'm sure I changed, and hopefully we learned, and we did some, even though I didn't. I wish I knew more about attachment, but we changed some so they learn different. But how much credit do you give to nature versus nurture in regards to attachment? Because you do speak of it so much, if not almost exclusively, in relation to our upbringing, our parents, our caregivers, and what was modeled.
Yeah, I think like with the emergence of epigenetics, I think I'm a big nurture person. I think that we have genetic predispositions to things. But I think when you think of children growing up in the same home, there's so many other impacts on us as people, right? So maybe you, for the first child that you have, are very overprotective or more overprotective than you are with the second child, because now you're not as fearful. That's a very common thing. Birth order has an impact on nurture, right? If a child grows up with older siblings or younger siblings, parents and caregivers go through different seasons of life or chapters or changes as they grow up. And how we're being programmed is so much of like what our nurture is, right? And we are programmed through anything that we're exposed to through repetition and emotion. So it may seem like a small thing, but if you start doing personal growth work between your first and second child, even if you're in the journey and you're just getting started, like there will just be such a big impact because of that. And even an impact on like having other siblings in the household and how much attention gets dispersed as the family grows. And like, there's so many impacts.
Ours is a cute, Taies. My first kid, my son, so he was born and had a seizure at 5 days old, ended up in the hospital and lived in the hospital for months. So we thought he was going to die. He gets all the attention there because then my wife got pregnant. Let's see, when he was 4 months old. That whole idea of you don't get pregnant when you're nursing did never work with us. And so got pregnant. So here comes along my little daughter 15 months later, and my son has significant needs, at the time. Now he's a miracle story and whatever, but at the time he got a lot of attention. She got a lot less. So there you go, right there on the nurture, aspect. I mean, it was really acute. And we talk about that openly now. And I would say, and I'll say this here publicly as they, may hear the show too, that he seems to require more direction, to put it, one way, than she does. I hear from him. He'll ask questions even now at 28 years old. She's 20, whatever she is, 6 or something. And I don't hear from her. Every once in a while, I have to text her and remind her, hey, I'm your dad. Just hanging out. Very independent. Anyway, so I guess that depicts what you're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful example. And thank goodness he was okay. But it's a really powerful example that those small things that, he was just in the hospital for a period of time in the grand scheme of his whole life, maybe seems like a snapshot, but they just have such a big impact on the formation of our personality and how it develops. And I'm a big nurture person. And I think as well, if you ever look at the work of like Dr. Joe Dispenza, he talks about how from an epigenetic point of view, our genes can change their expression and can kind of turn on and off like Christmas tree lights, like in real time in terms of how they express. So I think that when we look at how we perceive and interact with our environment and how we get conditioned, I think that even that has some sort of impact on like our genetic expression from a genetic predisposition point of view.
Well, I guess in this aspect, it's pretty in line. If I think about my grandfather, I would say he was dismissive, avoidant. I mean, that's my experience of him. And my dad, that's my experience of him. And I am too. So not only did I get the physical in-person example and experience of that, but to whatever level of, genetic percentage passed down, I would say I got that as well. So here we are. I wanted to just put that out there that we're talking about something that's not just another topic of, hey, this is a little part of your drive. This is significant as far as our wiring, our programming, and as you talked about the subconscious. And I want to get into that. Now, I do want to jump back just from a real world example that led you into this. When you talk about your parents, it was a tough divorce. You said they tended to bring out the worst in each other. What were there, because I'm always interested in the dynamics of couples, whether it is their Enneagram styles or their DISC profiles or Myers-Briggs or their human design or whatever. And now with attachment, to go kind of like, what are some of the oil and water attachment styles? So start with your parents and how that related.
So I think, with respect to their privacy and things like that as well, my mother for sure, she'll openly share it. She's fearful avoidant, or at least was fearful avoidant. And my dad says he thinks he was dismissive avoidant, but I think he was definitely fearful avoidant, maybe just leaning a little more dismissive. And it's interesting because fearful avoidance are the attachment styles that tend to be more volatile in relationships, right? They get triggered more easily. They come from historically usually a little more trauma. Even if it's like secondhand things from, different dynamics that happened within the family. And so that was definitely my mom's experience. She went through a tremendous amount of trauma. My dad, a little bit less so, but that was definitely still there. And if you take too fearful avoidance, what happens is they've got more core wounds. They have more unmet needs. They usually have a less regulated nervous system. So they usually spend a lot more time in like sympathetic nervous system mode, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And if you take two fearful avoidance together, they're just more likely to get in heated arguments and have more volatility in their relationship. And so I think that sort of encompasses a lot of what they went through. And, my parents were both, I think they didn't really want to share much with other people. They're both more private. And so I was the eldest of two children, and they would come to me with everything at a very young age and share like, oh, this is, your father said this, oh, your mother did this. Very intense things, very in-depth things that were a little beyond my pay grade as a young child.
Like a surrogate spouse kind of aspect?
Yes. I mean, I was very parentified 100%, like top tier parentification for sure. I think the beauty of that and the blessing of that is that I was so interested in how people work from such a young age that got me into this career that I like truly love now, and also set the stage for me to want to go deep and be able to do a lot of healing work in on myself, because I had a lot of healing work to do. But yeah, from a very young age, I was really brought into a lot of intimate.
Well, so in your own experience and you experiencing a harsh relationship that impacted you, so you became interested in relationships, what were the steps that you said, okay, I want to go into therapy, go into counseling or psychology, and then took you in the direction specifically of attachment?
So my outlet when I grew up in this kind of household was sports. So I played soccer, got a full ride scholarship to a D1 school, all these things. And before that happened, in my scouting year, so just going into 10th grade, my first kind of scouting year, I had knee surgery. And I thought, I'm never going to get a soccer scholarship. I'm never going to get out of my home. I wanted the freedom and independence that came with that as well. Like, okay, I can go like have a new chapter, a new season. And so I was on painkillers and I just was immediately addicted. Like it was like I had knee surgery, definitely had a lot of really intense feelings. It just felt like when I was on painkillers, it felt like, oh, like opiates just numb my experience and make life more manageable.
So it was a physical pain, and then it was I just lost my identity as well.
Yeah. Yes, that is absolutely the case. That's a huge part of it. It felt like my identity was being lost 100%. And so I obviously was prescribed painkillers, and I remember like being like, after coming into the first couple of days of being in like pain, just feeling like, oh, I feel differently. Like this makes life easier. Like I feel less stressed all the time. I feel less intense emotion. And I just felt like it like kind of calmed everything for me, which I think was something I was subconsciously seeking and didn't know how to access. And I felt like there was kind of a sense of like peace. And so that began like a 6.5 year struggle of almost daily opiate use. Went to inpatient rehab, outpatient rehab a couple times in the summer between school. And that was not working for me. I mean, mind you, I left the rehab inpatient at least very early, but it wasn't working for me. And so I actually got a soccer scholarship, was like hanging on to life by a thread. Like the inside of my world was a mess and complete chaos. And the outside of my world probably looked pretty okay. And I was fairly high functioning. But I was in a class one day and somebody said to me, oh, your conscious mind can't outwill or overpower your subconscious mind. And for me, like from early days after experiencing my first set of withdrawals, my first like experience going through withdrawals, I was scared. Like I was like, what's happening to me? I was very young to be like going down this path. And I was like, what's happening to me? And I started I was almost like trying to obsess over becoming sober. Like, how am I going to stop using? I'm going to delete people's numbers from my phone that I get this from. I'm going to avoid these people in the hallway. I'm going to, I would journal and journal and journal. I'm going to get clean. I'm going to, all the things. And then I would just repeat the pattern day after day after day. And for me, one of the hardest parts about that was that I felt so helpless. Like I just felt so like I'm so weak. I'm not good enough to overcome this. I felt so helpless to myself. Yeah. And I really blamed and criticized myself a lot for that. So to one day be in a class when I'm like just hanging on and somebody said to me, oh, your conscious mind can't outwill your subconscious mind. It was like, oh, like it's not that I'm weak or not good enough or all these different things. It's that my conscious says I'm going to get sober and my subconscious says, no, we have different motives. And so then I got really obsessed with like, how can you learn about this, like the subconscious mind? So I actually did like a year-long hypnotherapy certification, all these different things to learn. And I spent a lot of time trying to heal myself through them. I was really just doing all this stuff for me, like just to like get a handle on life again. And I was learning about core wounds. So all these core wounds that we have. Yeah. I was learning about how to meet your own needs because that's a big part of self-soothing. So you're not relying on opioids to soothe. You're learning to soothe yourself through understanding yourself. Nervous system regulation, like somatic processing, like parasympathetic versus sympathetic mode. And then I was doing a lot of work around boundaries and communication because I knew these were things I struggled with so much. And so I got so obsessed with this stuff. I was like, eat, live, breathe this stuff. It was almost my new addiction because I was getting sober and I was seeing impact. And I couldn't believe nobody was talking about 14 years ago, the subconscious mind. Like I was like, where is this stuff? It's so hard to track down and find. It wasn't as mainstream as it is today. And I started giving free workshops just to talk about it to people. I was like 21 years old at the time, like, hello, somebody listen. And then I had all these people be like, oh, will you take us in as clients? Like, and I was like, well, I'm still in school. I'm not even finished school, but okay. And so I started seeing clients and I had learned about attachment theory first year university. And what ended up happening is that you hear about it at a very high level, kind of like more temperament based, like here's your attachment style. And people kept bringing it up. Like I kept revisiting it in terms of relationship challenges people are having, which I had a lot of work to do on healing and forgiveness of relationships and my expectations of them. And then I realized all these things I was working on, like the core wounds, the needs, the emotional regulation, all these things I was working on with clients. If you knew somebody's attachment style, right away, you knew exactly what core wounds they had, what their relationship needs were, how they were struggling to emotionally regulate and what feelings they were struggling with, what their boundary issues were, and how they would communicate. And it was like, oh, so now if I just take all these things I was working on and I put them into what somebody's attachment style is, not only do I now know exactly what things to work on very specifically with people to create the best results, but I would actually be able to help somebody go from insecurely attached to securely attached, which was what I did for my own part of healing.
I want to, well, I feel like to do justice here, everybody should go take the quiz, which they can do, and we'll put that in the intro and whatnot. But to figure out where they are, but we should define those somewhat. And I also want to put out there, or ask you, I mean, we're all on the spectrum. I mean, if I came up as dismissive avoidant, I am not 100% dismissive avoidant. I mean, I assume we're all kind of on the spectrum of that. We all have the capability of healing. So it's not something to take and go, gosh, my quiz came up as, I think, 43% or something like that. Dismissive.
And was your biggest percentage was secure, and then dismissive was your secondary, probably?
No, dismissive is number one, 46%.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. You want to get candid here. Fearful avoidant was next at 31%.
Interesting.
Anxious preoccupied is next at 15%. And secure is 8%.
Wow. Interesting.
Now, I did these, I'm sensitive to doing any kind of a quiz or profile. I've been doing these since I was a kid. And I have to like really get out of my head and go, okay, just be honest with what my nature is, even if they are things that I'm aware of and I work to modify, today, but just to go where my base core, the lizard brain, whatever it is. So when I did the quiz, I lizarded that thing. This is the core Kevin, and that's what came out. I would say that's probably a decent shot.
And do you feel like sometimes when there's a conflict or a challenge in your relationship dynamics that you kind of will retreat, and that's your tendency, rather than to like be approach oriented and talk it out right away?
Yeah, and I am aware of that, even though I have not been well versed in attachment style necessarily or specifically. I mean, I got called out for that, in counseling a long time ago. Yeah. Which is interesting why nobody ever really zeroed in from the counseling standpoint on attachment style, but on my tendency to withdraw, from conflict. I withdraw, I stonewall. I'm out of there. I am, it's fight or flight. I'm flight, I'm gone. And it's not historically, it has not been, I'm gone. Give me some time. I need to think about this and come back. It's just, no, I'm gone and I'm gone.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah.
That's it. Well, real quick, give us is that fair to ask of, contextually, and we could have put this at the top of the show. I mean, these are the 4 areas. These are the 4 attachment styles. Give can you do that? Just a quick definition of each?
Yeah, so everybody listening can hear. Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of background as well on how they tend to come together. So our first attachment style of the 4 is the securely attached style. The securely attached style grows up with very healthy modeling as children. So they get a lot of what we call approach-oriented behaviors in the psychology world, which means they get a lot of when they cry or express needs, the parent approaches them, comes towards them, tries to soothe, tries to figure out what's going on. Yeah. And so a child learns, first of all, it's safe to express my emotions. It's positively reinforced. It's safe to rely on people. I can trust that people will care about my emotions and my feelings and that they want to meet my needs. And that from a very young age has a huge impact on our programming. So this person as a child grows up as an adult to feel like they can trust, they can open up, they can share their needs. Emotions are a safe thing to express and communicate and share because they see that people in their life come towards them. And so they also feel safe holding that space for other people because that's the modeling they get. And so the securely attached.
Can I speak to that? Just my one experience, Taies, my one experience was too many years ago, and my wife must have read something. I need to ask her. Must have read something on attachment style. And she says, "Oh my gosh, honey, listen to this." And she reads this thing, and it basically said, the boiled down version was, a kid comes in with a bloody knee from playing on the playground. Yeah. And I'll just say what I did. As a dad, I didn't know any better. I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm there. I am full of love. I'm full of intent. I'm there for you. And oh my gosh, your knee's bleeding. Hold on, let me get the antiseptic and the stuff, and I'll wash it off and get a Band-Aid on that and fix it.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And she says, I'm reading this thing that says we're probably better off to actually just give the kid a hug and say, I'm so sorry, and just kind of be there for him. Like, are you serious? I was initially, I was mad because I thought, I just didn't know. I didn't know. I'm not a bad guy. I didn't know. And that's what I'm thinking. And so I did that. So the next time the kid runs in, I'm like, okay, this feels stupid. They're bleeding all over the place and there's gravel in it. Okay, whatever. I'll try it. Oh, I'm so sorry, honey. Oh gosh, that must hurt. And I hug them and they whimper and then kind of get over it and run off. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you're still bleeding. I guess we don't buy Band-Aids anymore because you don't need that. Like, holy smokes. I had no idea. Now I should have taken that. The big question is, why didn't you take that, Kevin, and go into attachment style? I don't know, but that's the one thing that I heard on attachment and I saw the difference and it was amazing. Even that little bit was an amazing change.
And it's so cool because, like, obviously you're somebody who takes in all the information, applies it, uses it. And that's, I think, not most people to begin with, but also attachment theory dynamics weren't around that much. Like, it was very high level until the past decade or so. It was very like, oh, you have an attachment style, you have a certain sort of temperament, and here's how it develops, and it may affect your adult relationships. And that was kind of it. Whereas now it's a lot more in depth. So I think that's probably a part of the reason why. But to your point, like, that's exactly like when we have that emotional nurturing or care, we feel like, okay, we can soothe more quickly, and then we can sort of get back on our horse for life and go out there. And it sort of provides a secure landing base for children. So that's the secure.
I still didn't address their emotions. That took a lot longer past that. But to what you said, that this is high level and not brought in, it's really interesting that now in watching you and looking at your stuff, you now bring this to the very beginning, like dating 101. Yeah. Like first date, it's like, all right, let's get this out of the way, take your quiz and let's get this. I mean, that's a big shift. Okay. I keep interrupting you defining this.
I love it. It's great. I love chatting about stuff. So that's the securely attached style. And obviously, statistically, as adults, they do the best in relationships because they have all the programming and nurture for the foundation to trust, to rely, to connect, to soothe each other, to also feel like they can soothe themselves. So they tend to feel very confident, worthy of love, and have less relationship fears and doubts and unmet needs. And then you go into the other three, and there's 3 insecurely attached styles. And this is, according to more recent research, is now the vast majority of the population. We have the anxious attachment style basically on one end. And the anxious attachment style usually has a lot of love in their upbringing, but a lot of inconsistency accompanies that love. So we can call it real or perceived abandonment. So either there can actually be a divorce where a parent is suddenly not around as much, even though the parent's loving. Now they only see them on Tuesday nights, for example, and that can create this abandonment wound for a child. Or more often, it's that we have an anxiously attached style because we have 2 loving parents, but they both work a lot. So love is there, and then love feels like it's being taken away. And maybe they're left with the grandparents or they're in after school programs. And so they get love is there, love is taken away, love is there, taken away. And it's a repetition and emotion of things that conditions our subconscious mind, that nurtures our pattern.
So anxious, you said, so it's inconsistent. So it could be chaos. What did we put, neglect in there?
No, that would actually be fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant. So we wouldn't even see necessarily like neglect. We would see that there's a foundation of very loving connection, but there's this sense of it being, when is it going? Is it going to be taken away? Like, am I going to be, not having my parents around for the weekend as they go to work over the weekend or travel for work? Or it tends to be that there's a lot of love, but there's that inconsistency of it. And I would call it uncertainty more than I would call it like chaos or volatility or neglect. I would call it like inconsistency and uncertainty. And so this child, they grow up and they end up going, I'm going to be abandoned. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the love to be taken away. And they become very hyper vigilant about any change in the pattern of communication or of love being given or of validation or reinforcement or not seeing their partner enough. And so as adults, they become somebody who's constantly fixated on maintaining proximity, trying to get closer to somebody, not wanting them to pull away or being let go of. And their big wounds in relationships are afraid of being abandoned, alone, rejected, excluded, disliked, and not good enough. And they also feel like if that connection's taken away, they feel unsafe and they really struggle to self-soothe. They try to exclusively soothe through other people.
That one, self-soothing. I mean, you talked about that. It was interesting. because I know an anxious person, and they struggle, they seek the soothing with someone else. Now, you mentioned it earlier in regards to your use of opioids, that you sought the soothing through, medication, whatever it may be. Okay, I'm going to wait for the next question. Keep going. So we got secure, we got anxious, and I'm
then
taking
we
notes.
have,
Go to the.
yeah, and then we have on the far other end of the continuum, we have the dismissive avoidant. And the dismissive avoidance is pretty much the opposite of the anxious in a lot of ways. Now, the main theme of the dismissive avoidance childhood is childhood emotional neglect. So it can be, that there's really overt neglect, like parents are like never around, they're very uncaring, they're not present, they're not available, but that's a vast minority of how dismissive avoidance attachment is developed. The vast majority is actually that there's a very stable family household, not much fighting, everything's on time, kids are in school, food's on the table, it's structured, but the parent or parents are not emotionally available in the same way. So basically what happens is if a child is crying, they come home from school, they had a bad day, it's sort of like, you're fine. It's a quick, like sort of stiff upper lip. There's not a lot of talk about emotions. There's not a lot of being very present with a child's emotions and emotional experience. It's a lot more about like what needs to be done. How should we show up? And it's a lot more practical in a lot of ways. And so dismissive avoidant children, oftentimes they'll be like, I had an idyllic childhood as adults. They'll be like, childhood was great. There was no, terrible thing that happened to me. It was pretty safe and stable. But oftentimes there's this very quiet void of having their emotional needs met, having the ability to build emotional literacy or feel like they're safe to express themselves. And what happens for a child when there's this lack of nurturing for that emotional part of themselves, which if you think of like a person, we sort of have like our physical pillar, our mental pillar, our emotional pillar of life. When one of those big pillars is not being nurtured, a child's mind can't be like, oh, we personalize everything as children. So the child isn't like, oh, my mom is emotionally unavailable. Instead, a child is like, oh, they internalize this feeling of shame. Like, oh, there must be something wrong with me that like I'm not getting connected to in this way. And so the dismissive avoidant child grows up as an adult to have a lot of programming where it's like, it's weak if I express emotion. It's unsafe to be vulnerable. I'm not really capable nor supposed to really like deeply soothe people I'm in relationships with. And they become afraid of being too vulnerable or feeling too much around other people. And because of internalizing that sense of shame at a very young age, they also, although they're very stoic and really good at not showing it, they tend to be quite sensitive to criticism. It makes them feel like, oh, like they really take it as like, if somebody says, hey, I want you to show up better in this way, they don't really hear like, oh, my behavior needs to change. They hear it and receive it usually as like, at my core, I am defective or something's wrong with me. And so they, as adults, are pretty much the opposite of the anxious attachment style, where they tend to keep trying to create space. And they want to maintain their freedom, their independence, their autonomy. They definitely feel this sense of, not wanting to even like have a conflict. Will tend to be, like we sort of talked about, like pull away in conflict, shut down, like ice things out, because they have these kind of deep-rooted beliefs of like, well, we're just supposed to meet our own needs. And then, we're not supposed to have conflict, whereas conflict sort of like, hey, hash it out together, meet each other's needs. There's an element of like interdependency there that dismissive avoidants usually don't get much modeling for growing up. And so they can be very stable, very practical, very intellectual people, very calm, often quite successful. But there's still this kind of internal emotional repression of that pillar of their lives unless they do the work on some of that stuff. So that's the dismissive avoidant attachment style.
And that just undressed me. I mean, that's it. Totally, Taies. That's me. The home that was, gosh, it was loving. It was secure. It was idyllic. It was the beaver cleaver, family and whatnot. And yet there was not a place. My parents had no modeling either of what to do with emotions. And then the best that they got in their pursuit, I was an only child the first 7 years of my life. I was the first kid. And their pursuit was really personal development. And it was listening to, motivational speakers. And it was kind of like, gosh, a negative emotion. We need to fix that, which seems right and seems good, but there was no place. But I wanted to ask too, is there a place too, as parents are hearing this or thinking about their own, childhood as well, where I feel like I had a propensity to embrace that as well. Like maybe there was something in me that I wasn't really looking to express a lot of emotion. Anyways, they're not good with it. We just don't do that. Because I wonder if I'd have to ask my dad just passed away, but I have to ask my mom, did she try that at some point? I would be interested if she said, yeah, gosh, sometimes I would try to, and you didn't want to go there at all, and wonder if she got frustrated with me. So is there a propensity in us sometimes to, even as kids, to embrace these things? Meaning, I'm not trying to absolve parenting at all, but where some kids have a propensity to embrace something we call it a genetic standpoint, if you want.
Yeah, I think, of course, genetics also always plays some sort of role. But I think it was really interesting. So John Bowlby, who originally came up with attachment theory out of Cambridge University, he had something called the strange situation experiment. And the strange situation experiment, what they would do is they would take a child between the ages of 0 to 2 years old, and they would have them go into what was sort of like a doctor's office waiting room with the child, so just one parent. And they would have the parent, and it would be the primary caregiver. So in this case, usually the mother at the time that attachment theory was originally developed. And they would have the parent leave the room and have a stranger come into the room, to the waiting room.
Right.
And the parent would leave the room just momentarily and then have the parent come back in and return to pick up the child. And between 0 to 2 years old, you could determine what somebody's attachment style was based on how the child would react. So dismissive avoidance, it's so interesting when the parent would come back in the room, the parent would approach the child to pick them up, to be like, hey, I'm here. And the child, you'd see over and over again, they'd go like this, turn away from the parent, not look at the parent, not try to rebond or reconnect or attach to the parent in any way after feeling the sense of the parent leaving the room and leaving them in a strange situation. And you'd see the anxious attachment style as soon as the parent left the room, immediately in tears, often panicking. When the parent would return to the room, they'd hold on to the parent extremely tightly, really be hypervigilant, try to maintain proximity and closeness. And then the fearful avoidant, which is the last attachment style that we'll go through, they would be very hot and cold with the parent. So they'd become very aggravated, ambivalent when the parent would leave, kind of, fussy and frustrated. Then the parent would come back in. They kind of move towards the parent, then move away from the parent. But try to be close to the parent, but not get soothed by the parent. And they were very, experiencing both sides of the attachment continuum, which is so much of what fearful avoidant is. And so you can make the argument that, which I think is a pretty good argument, that our attachment style develops so young based on even when we're crying as children, based on how much like self-soothing we're getting or being forced to do versus how much soothing we're getting through the parent, how much there's approach-oriented behavior. So I think that probably the propensity that you felt might have been potentially conditioned from, maybe a genetic predisposition, but a lot of nurture at a young age.
Well, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but even to think about let me take myself as a father. So here I am as a father. So what was I when my son was born? I was 23, 24. So I'm a young guy. I'm still a kid. And I've got this baby who maybe he's crying, or maybe in this, we're in the hospital thinking, whatever. My emotional state, who knows what that was. And if we want to take that into the energy that I'm exuding, that even if I'm sitting there trying to comfort, but I am feeling terror, how did that affect him? That's weighty.
And they say that actually has a huge part of that, can actually play a big role in developing attachment styles, is the parent's temperament when trying to soothe the child, which is natural and normal, right? Like, this is, of course, we're going to be scared when we don't have it figured out. And it's a big responsibility to have a child. And so like, that makes so much sense that you felt that way, but that for sure will have some degree of impact on the child feeling like, okay, if I'm not deriving a sense of comfort from the attunement or presence of my parent, that can also cause them to feel like, okay, I don't feel comfortable. Let me shut down my emotions as well.
I'm afraid I was just stoic. I think I was holding, kid and he's crying. I'm thinking, well, that's not good. We got to fix that crap. Give me a book. Let's figure out some kind of a method. And I can tell you the books. That's what I did. It was like, we got to stop that.
That is still so much more than most parents do. Right? Like, it's still so much more that you try to read and research and figure it out. And of course, there's like a little bit of residue that if you weren't able to be fully present or fully attuned, but like, it's still a blessing that was the type of parent that your kids had.
Well, thank you. All right. I got more questions, but fearful, we still haven't done fearful.
Yes. So fearful avoidant is sometimes referred to as anxious avoidant or disorganized attachment style. And I like anxious avoidant because The anxious avoidant describes that they have both the experience of being anxious in relationships and avoidant in relationships. They share in both sides of the attachment spectrum. So I was a fearful avoidant. Fearful avoidants are often developed out of chaos, right? So like having these really good moments with love and connection, but then maybe having really scary ones where there's like really extreme fighting, or you're being exposed to things that are out of your depths to deal with, like a parentified child. Other examples can be things like having a parent who's an alcoholic, for example. And it's like, let's say mom's the alcoholic. One day she's in a good mood, she's drinking, she's happy and she's fun. Another day she's drank way too much, she's very angry and cruel. Another day mom's sober, she's kind of nice, or she's really grumpy because she's going through, withdrawals. So you can get like, it's like you never know what you're going to get, right? And that kind of dynamic for a child causes them to be extremely hypervigilant about everything. And so they experience having moments of fearing abandonment as children. And because there are those good moments of closeness and connection, but then they also sometimes really fear love and connection because they see really big, scary things. And so this child grows up to be very hypervigilant, and it's like they can't decide how they want to soothe, right? And so, as an adult, what you experience as fearful avoidant, and this was definitely my experience until I did a lot of healing around this, was it's like you want closeness and you're like, come get close to me, and you're available for closeness. And then when people actually get close and it feels vulnerable, you're like, no, get back. And it's like you're the hot and cold person in relationships all the time as an adult, where you want closeness, but you're afraid of actual commitment and afraid of real vulnerability. And what I experienced and have had, when I was in client practice or through programs now, you just see everybody mirroring the same sort of pattern. Is it's like you constantly flip flop between should I stay or should I go? Or should I move towards this person or should I pull away? And it's like you can't really decide which side you belong on. And it's honestly exhausting. But also there tends to be a lot of fears around the abandonment, but also fears around being trapped, and also a lot of fears around betrayal, not thinking that people are going to like follow through or show up. And so there's a lot of that kind of hot and cold patterning in there.
Gosh, there's so much, it's so deep. Obviously, you've devoted yourself to this and have millions of people following you because of this. But I mean, to look at it, if we look at conflict, what you are saying it feels like what you are saying is that so conflict comes along. So, you got a couple and conflict comes along. Here's this thing. And this one style is saying, oh, this is what this means. And the other is going, oh, this is what this means. Those are different, first off. And then the needs, like you just talked about, the anxious attachment, or even fearful anxious, is going to be moving towards, correct? They're going to be going, oh, I need to come towards this person to get soothing, to fix it. And me on the other side, as the dismissive avoidant, is I'm gone. I need to get out of here and do that, which I'm learning, even from a healthy standpoint. I do probably need to go, gosh, I hear you. I'm with you. I do need some space to process now. That's me. But then I also, out of care, need to come back, which has not been my strong suit as well. But either way, you've got something that happened, and then you've got these different. We're back to the, what was that old book? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. This is like we're all from different planets. We're all from different planets. You've got 4 you're talking about here, and it's figuring out which 4 are you. And again, you're not. I do. This is a big point to me on any kind of profiling, if we call that, because if I look at this, let me go back down to my thing and say, oh yeah, dismissive avoidant, that's me. Well, it said 46%. 31% was also fearful avoidant. So I don't really need to look at that as well. There's part of me that's that. And actually, I was so much those two. I probably should just stick there. But depending on somebody's quiz, they're going to need, they're going to relate. They're not a thoroughbred, just one thing. It's figuring out your secret sauce and saying, oh, this is my propensity. How can I heal that? And then, of course, if there's somebody else, to know theirs as well. But back to the healing part. I mean, we're hearing this. We do the quiz. We say, gosh, that's me. I can't go back and get reparented. We're done there. It's now up to me, or is this a fair statement? Now I have to reparent myself.
Yes. Okay. So much of changing our attachment style, so I always use this framework for healing, and it starts with, I call it CNE BCB. It's just the acronym. So CNE is like our core wounds, our needs, our emotional regulation. We have to do that work for ourselves first. Once we have reprogrammed a lot of these core wounds and we know our needs and we can meet our own needs, we can emotionally regulate as a result of those things, then I can go out into the world and I can then connect with others and communicate better, set better boundaries, have better behaviors around other people. So rather than fleeing, I can be more approach oriented. But we always do the inner reparenting first. And you touched on something a moment ago, and I just want to go back to for a second, where we talked about, as a dismissive avoidant, if you're dating somebody anxious, they want closeness and you're like, okay, I want to pull away. And what's so interesting is that as this takes place, there's something in every single relationship, and it's called a primary triggering pattern. Mm-hmm. And what happens in a primary trigger pattern is that exactly your biggest core trigger or core wound, when you behave in response to it, that behavior will then trigger your partner's biggest core wound. And how they behave when they're triggered, in turn, will re-trigger yours, and it will just go around in a vicious cycle. So I laughed a moment ago because you were hitting the nail on the head, where like what we'll often see in at least the dismissive anxious dynamic is a dismissive will maybe take some space because they need more freedom and autonomy in terms of their needs. And their anxious partner, who's hypervigilant to that, will be like, oh, they're pulling away. Are they falling out of love? Are they going to abandon me? And so that's their core wound. I'm abandoned. And they respond to that abandonment core wound by trying to hold on tighter. And a big core wound for the dismissive is I am trapped. And so they hold on really tight. And then, of course, the dismissive is going, whoa, and I'm feeling trapped. And so they pull away further. And then the anxious person feels more abandoned. And this can go around and around forever in relationships. So when you think of attachment styles, it's sort of like your set of rules for how to love, for how to connect at a subconscious level. You're not necessarily conscious of these things. And so if you imagine that you sit down and like you and I are going to play a board game, but you have the rules for Monopoly and I have the rules for Scrabble, we're going to have a tough time. Like there's going to be some confusion and friction because we're going, well, hold on, you're supposed to do it this way, and vice versa. And so when we look at different attachment styles, it's so valuable to realize, like when we can understand our attachment style versus somebody else's, then we can start understanding what they need and how we can negotiate about those needs so we can interact in a way that allows for both people to have their needs met. So that's useful for that side of things. When it comes to healing, that's where we go back to that framework of like recondition those core wounds and fears, learn to meet our own needs, learn to emotionally regulate. And we can unpack like all of those as separate things because they're all very meaningful entities, but that's sort of the overarching framework.
Okay, let me come in with, you have me thinking of, I'll call it a triangle, but three different things. I mean, one, there is me. So here I am, I did the quiz, I relate to this stuff. And so just autonomously, let's get rid of my relationships or whatever and just say, okay, here's what I've got to work on if I want to move towards a secure attachment style. So we got that. So everybody hearing, we all had the opportunity to do that. Now, if you are, let's just say, not married, you're single, whatever, you have the opportunity to do that and to be in tune with who you may partner with and come to. So I've got a question there, but then the other side is if you are, let's say you are married, you're in a committed relationship, whatever, is figuring out your styles and figuring out how to best mesh together with what you have. Because, and I want to come back to the person. So here I am, 46%. And again, I want some credit for, I did the lizard brain here. I hope that I modify some of this, but if we say that's my style, 46% dismissive avoidant and 31% fearful avoidant. So I am one avoidant son of a gun. I'm going to do the work. Let's say I'm going to do the work to move towards secure. I'm never going to leave some of those propensities. Those are always going to be some difficult. Well, you tell me that. Tell me. I mean, they're never going to go away.
Okay. I love your question. I know exactly what you're saying. What parts of me, even if I become securely attached, like, do I just lose my whole personality? Like, where is this? And the actual answer is there's a difference between moving from truth versus moving from fear. So I like to think of moving from truth as being our needs. So as a person, you may have higher needs with a more avoidant leaning set of styles there for independence, autonomy, acknowledgement, empathy, support. Like these are big, more avoidant attachment style needs. Acceptance is a big one. But knowing that you have the autonomy and freedom to kind of make your own decisions, do things your own way, like that tends to be a big part of more avoidant leaning. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody who's anxiously attached will need a lot more certainty, validation, encouragement, reassurance, to feel wanted, important, prioritized, like, so very different sets of needs. But for you, those will be truthful. The thing that we want to really do the healing work on is, number one, our core wounds. So a lot of when we go through pain, and this is what our fears are, right? This is us moving from fear. So if you go through, let's say, childhood emotional neglect as an example, then, even though it may be, everything's good otherwise, there's kind of this under the radar emotional neglect that takes place. It's very likely that you have core wounds of feeling unsafe in conflict, potentially, at least in your past, weak if you're too vulnerable or open up too much with people, a sense of feeling like this something's wrong with me if I get criticism, or dynamic, you can take it really to heart in a sense, and a sense of feeling like, wait, I don't know if I am able to really soothe my partner. I don't know if I'm capable of doing these things that are required from me. So there tends to be a few big core wounds. Now that when we are in conflict and for example, you're going, okay, I feel unsafe, I move away. You moved from fear, right? You responded from fear because it felt uncomfortable. Even if you weren't feeling afraid per se, you were feeling a little worried or a sense of discomfort and move away from conflict. So that's the stuff we heal, right? We work through these core beliefs that we've adopted, because those are the parts that you can't even call them like our authentic self. It's just like our fear selves that we adopted these limiting patterns around. So what we do is we work to reprogram those core wounds at a subconscious level, which we can talk about how to do in a few minutes. But that's the part where when we reprogram those fears, the belief that I am defective or I am unsafe, or the belief that I will be trapped or helpless or powerless in a conflict, or weak if I'm vulnerable, those core wounds, when we heal those, we become way more secure. And then we can move from a place where, I still have my needs as a person and my identity and the things I like, but I can meet those needs. I can communicate them better to my partner in a way that's going to get me seen and heard. And so I'll feel more fulfilled in the relationship, but I'm moving from truth instead of fear.
Kind of I'm not going to stop desiring approval, let's say, but I'm going to learn to be okay even if I don't get it.
Yes, exactly that. And we learn to give our needs to ourselves a little more. So sometimes even if we're over desiring things, like, this probably isn't you because it's not a very dismissive avoidant thing. You may be like, oh yeah, I value approval. But sometimes we can have people who are particularly anxiously attached, people who way overvalue approval, kind of like they'll choose other people's approval over their own opinions or feelings. And that's something that more avoidants don't really do as much. So they'll tend to be like, I could still value approval, but I'm going to do what feels right for me kind of at the end of the day. And anxiously attached individuals, like, if they learn to meet their own needs and approve of themselves, encourage themselves, build themselves up, criticize themselves less, what ends up happening is their need for approval comes more into balance, where it's like, that can be important to me and I can care about it, but it's not going to dictate my big life decisions at the end of the day. And they can come more into that healthy sense of self.
Okay, balance this one then on an aspect of, I guess we call it rejection or abandonment. So conflict comes up, and I can look at that with fear that relationship's going to is going to be removed, or love is going to be removed. There's conflict, and I think I somehow adopted that as a kid, that I was afraid of conflict, because if there's conflict, if there is a disagreement, that love is going to be removed. Which, goodness, I'm sure I don't want to pick on my dad a bit, because he tended to be my focal point. Did he remove love? No, but I think he didn't know how to deal with it. So conflict felt really bad. So I took that here. So now today I'm looking at it, and I'm going to ask you on the reprogramming side, because it feels like there's two aspects. One, I can look at that and go, okay, I'm having conflict with whoever, spouse, a kid, a partner, whatever it is, a business partner, whatever, having conflict, and go, okay, Kevin, doesn't mean that they don't like you anymore or they don't love you anymore. So let go of that. That's false. That's a lie. That's one piece. But now, depending on who they are and what they are, maybe it is true. Maybe they are going to remove love or whatever. That's on them. I can't control that. So then I also have the work to, one, is that a lie? Or two, am I just okay either way? Reconcile that for me.
Okay. So we'll go deep here for just a moment. So the first part is the core wound. And I love this question. So you have the core wound. So the belief that, like, if I'm in conflict, love is going to be removed. So we'll call it the I am unloved core wound, because that's one of the big ones in there. And so we have this core wound. You are doing the work. You have all the insight. You know consciously. You can gain the insight now. You can you could start this tomorrow. There's a conflict with your wife, let's pretend, and you are like, well, my wife's not going to stop loving me. And you can, you can equilibrate that meaning with your conscious mind. But then we have to ask the question, like, what's the difference between insight and actual reconditioning, so that when there is conflict, my mind doesn't even have to go to, oh, love is going to be removed. I don't even tell that story to myself anymore.
Right. You just nailed it, because intellectually I can sit there and go, okay, I know this, but it still feels terrifying.
Exactly. And that's this work. This is what I love so much. And that's like it's like, how do we bring this to the subconscious reconditioning part so that we don't have to be like this? This was me. Like, I was so fearful, avoidant. How could I bring my life so that it doesn't have to be, I'm dealing with all the chaos internally all the time? How can we actually reprogram at root level? So there's a lot of different exercises, but I'll share one really interesting one. So this is called autosuggestion. It comes sort of from roots in hypnotherapy. It's sort of a blend between hypnotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so autosuggestion, if I were to say to you, just as a side note, Kevin, whatever you do not think of the pink elephant. You probably like flash some image of a pink elephant. And it's because your conscious mind speaks language. Your subconscious mind doesn't hear language very well at all. It sees and experiences communication in emotion and in imagery. So nobody wakes up and says consciously, today, if I get into an argument with my spouse, I'm going to tell myself the story that love will be removed and that I am unloved. Nobody's doing that intentionally. These are subconscious challenges that we're experiencing from pre-existing subconscious imprints that we had mostly from childhood. And so what happens is we need to use our conscious mind to reprogram these subconscious limiting beliefs and fears. And how we do this is we have to speak in emotion and in imagery. And so how this works is we take the core wound, I am unloved or love will be removed, and we oppose it. Love will stay even in conflict, or I am still loved even if there's a conflict, right? So we reframe it to the opposite. And then research neuroplastically shows that it takes 21 days to fire and wire neural networks so that they get strong enough to stick, to stay. And so what we do is we can't just use affirmations. I am not a big fan of affirmations. I am loved, I am loved, I am loved, because you're just speaking to your conscious mind, right? That's language again. And so your subconscious isn't getting that, and the problem exists at the subconscious level. So what we have to do instead is we have to come up with 10 pieces of evidence or memories, because if you look at what a memory is just emotion and imagery. So if I were to say to you, okay, tell me your favorite childhood memory, and let's say you're like, I was on the playground with my dad. As you're telling the memory, you would see the images of the playground. Yeah. And you would feel the emotion. You would start smiling as you're telling the story. So when we pick up 10 pieces of memory for why it is possible to still be loved even in conflict, and we do 10 for the repetition, we do the memory because it gives us the emotion and imagery, the language of the subconscious mind. When we do this for 21 days, we actually recondition these core beliefs to the point where when you can sit down, for example, and go, how was I loved even in conflict? And you come up with 10 pieces of memory where I had this really big fight, but then my dad came around, or I had this challenge that took place, but then I knew how much my mom still loved because of this, and this, or my wife, or my kids. When you come up with these 10 pieces of evidence for how love will stay, even if there's conflict, and then you re-listen to them or reread them so that you feel and see them in your images, right, in your memory, for 21 days, we actually rewire the neural networks all together. And old neural pathways are like muscles. They atrophy, just like if you don't work out your bicep muscles atrophy. Yeah. So this is how we actually recondition limiting beliefs and fears around abandonment or betrayal or feeling not good enough or unworthy or unloved or defective, or all these different big core wounds that we can carry for decades can actually be washed free in 21 days with a tool like this.
Which is a big point I wanted to hit on here. I mean, reading this thing, it's pretty, your book is sitting over my shoulder here, Learning Love, and doing that or taking the quiz. And I think for most people, it's pretty blatant. Like, gosh, that rings true. There I am. Okay, well, that is literally not helpful at all. I mean, unless, well, it could not be. it could not be helpful at all if we just take that, as you said, as just core knowledge. Okay, great. There I am. There's my propensity. That rings true. Yeah. Okay. You're no better off than you were.
How do we change it? That's
Yeah.
the real work that begins. Exactly.
Yes. And I know this is overall what you just said, 21 days. I'm thinking about working out. You talked about biceps. If I want my bicep to be bigger, I'm going to have to do, whatever curls or whatever. I'm going to do 4 different sets of things with, 10 repetitions each, probably twice a week for however long I want to go to get my biceps to some certain size. And I have to eat along with that to feed that muscle. I got to sleep to recover. I mean, there's so much. I always want to, this is not easy. What we're talking about is a dramatic opportunity, because this is how, for me, this is how I have seen relationships all my life. And there's other aspects that I've worked on and I've gotten better with and I've gotten awareness, but still, this is a huge one to look at and go, this is the filter that I see well, actually take that, because before that, bring it back to me personally, even outside of relationships, because I know this is a big part of your thing. The first thing is relationship with self. So, okay, kind of skipped over that. So take that, and outside of a relationship, if I'm just Kevin out on my own, this is how I relate to me. Put it in that frame.
Yes. So the first part that we have to look at is when we have those core wounds. There's an acronym I give to people a lot. It's like BTEA. So you can think of core wounds as limiting beliefs. They're the same thing, right? They're just painful limiting beliefs. So if I believe that I'm not good enough, or I'm trapped, or I'm abandoned, depending on what somebody's attachment style is, right? Or in your case, if I believe that love will be taken away in conflict, I'm unloved in a conflict. If I believe that, then I start thinking thoughts that are in alignment with that, right? What if the conflict goes wrong? What if it ends the relationship? What if, and so we start thinking thoughts. You can think of the belief as like the tree trunk, and the thoughts are the tree branches, right? If somebody thinks I'm not good enough, they go into a social event and they go, oh, I'm not interesting enough or funny enough or whatever it might be. All those thoughts kind of come off of that tree trunk of the belief. How do we feel when we're thinking those types of thoughts, right? We feel insecure or sad or frustrated or upset. And it actually affects us neurochemically, because if we have a lot of an absence of serotonin or dopamine or oxytocin, because we're having more negative neurochemicals like cortisol or norepinephrine all day because we're thinking more negative thoughts, then it affects us emotionally, it affects us neurochemically. And then a scientist, a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio in 2008 discovered that every single decision we make is based on our emotions. Even people who think they're very rational, logical thinkers are making emotionally based decisions at the tipping point, and then they're just quick to rationalize them through logic. So you have this like relationship to self part. And it's like, if I'm carrying around all these core wounds, it's affecting what I believe about myself and other people, which affects how I think all day, how I feel all day, how I neurochemically am affected. And my actions will follow as coping mechanisms that may be destructive. Maybe I feel stressed and then I binge watch television, or I drink a bunch of wine, or we have these negative actions or coping mechanisms to follow. So the first part in the relationship to self is healing our core wounds, because that's for us. That's so that I'm not triggered all day about feeling trapped or helpless or unloved or all these things that are a nightmare to live in when we're telling ourselves those stories and believing and feeling those things. So reprogramming our core wounds is first. That's the biggest part. The second part of the relationship to self, and this really goes into reparenting, is we have to look at our needs. And the best way to heal in relationship to self our needs is to make a list of all the needs that you probably had as a child when you think back to hard times, what you really needed that you didn't get met, and become very good at giving those things to yourself as an adult. And so we can talk about them by attachment style. Like, again, like dismissive avoidance tend to really need acknowledgement, appreciation, acceptance, autonomy, freedom, a sense of being appreciated and empathized with, supported. Those are like the big dismissive avoidant needs. Anxious attachment styles, they have their own set of needs that we can go through. But basically, we have to know what our needs are by our attachment style. Yeah. And be really good at giving them to ourselves. And what often happens is, because our attachment style, when it's formed with our caregivers, forms the relationship we have to ourselves. The funny part is that usually whatever you didn't get in childhood, you instead are really poor at giving to yourself.
Yeah.
So, you look at maybe a dismissive avoidant gets emotionally neglected, maybe before you're doing the work as an adult. Maybe you neglected your own emotions all the time and kind of repress them down and push them away, because we will mirror the relationship to ourselves that we got from our parents. And so reparenting means getting clear on what those big needs are, and then actually forming a daily habit or strategy to make sure that we're giving to ourselves in those ways, which then allows us to take a next huge step towards becoming more securely attached, feeling more emotionally regulated, and a greater sense of fulfillment within ourselves.
Okay. I'm going to take what you just said there and bring it to call it a couples or a romantic relationship, whatever, but partnering. I mean, I guess you could do it even with a business partnership, whatever. If we're going to, get in bed together, in essence, a marriage, of whether it's business or otherwise or whatever, if we're going to get to that aspect of intimacy in a relationship, then it'd be great if we're both doing this work and we are both doing our best to become securely attached. How wonderful would that be? Be that as it may, though, what would Taies, though, as our marriage counselor, where would she look and go, "Ugh, man, if you're knowing that your nature is really, on this attachment style and your nature is there, even though you're trying to work on it, there's some matches that are going to be harder than others, or that you're going to have your work cut out for you." Is that fair to say some of them are, or are you going to say, no, it doesn't matter, all of you, but you just need to be aware of where you are and where your triggers are and how you may possibly trigger each other if you're not taking proactive action, in essence?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I worked with couples for about 10 years. So I did a lot
Mm-hmm.
of, and I would see like 40 people a week. So I saw lots of people. And I do not care if I were still running a practice today. I will tell you loud and clear, I don't care what someone's attachment style is. I don't care how much trauma they have. I don't care how many core wounds they have. I don't care how many unmet needs they have. I just want to know that two people are going to show up and they want to do the work. Because if you want to do the work, we plug into the subconscious reprogramming tools. We can reprogram the core wounds. We can learn about exactly what each attachment style's needs are. They start meeting them themselves. They start healing and becoming more secure as a result. And then those same needs they bring into partnership and they share with each other. These are things that I need. We talk about strategies for how to meet those needs and communicate in healthy ways about them. And like right there, if you nail those few things, not only are you going to see on an individual basis that you're going to be so much more securely attached and feel better and feel less triggered and more fulfilled and more present, but it also, your relationship fulfillment is going to increase dramatically because you actually feel seen and connected to. Your needs are being met by your partner, your true needs. You can communicate openly. You have less of these core wounds that are triggering you in an argument or conflict. So like these are huge things, but if one person is not willing to do the work, if one person's being dragged, their butts being dragged to marriage counseling, or things like that, that's where the problem really exists. So it's less about what somebody's attachment style is. I would say you really don't see attachment styles of the same nature ending up together very often. Like you won't see two anxiously attached individuals in a lasting relationship, nor will you see two dismissive avoidants in a relationship. Fearful avoidants are the exception because they both have an anxious and avoidant side, so they can kind of pinball each other, but we usually are attracted to our opposites. And so that's the exception, but everybody triggers each other a lot in different ways. It's more about who's doing the work and who's not that will matter.
I mean, any of these, the person, our predispositions, let's call it that, our predispositions, whether it's nature, whether it's nurture. When we go down the rabbit hole, Taies, I mean, it's always been for me a little bit almost overwhelming sometimes because I can get to looking at it going, I have no idea who I actually am. I mean, none of us can be fully, we couldn't have a perfect upbringing. We can't have a perfect environment. We can't be exposed to everything. I mean, we are going to be programmed in a limited way, no matter what. And you can almost kind of think, I have no idea who the natural me would be. We're trying to figure that out. Because as you talk about this, I'm looking at some of the stuff we've talked about with dismissive avoidant, which I score so highly on, and go, gosh, I could see why I have always been an entrepreneur. Always worked for myself because I don't like conflict and I don't like feeling. You said earlier in regards to dismissive, the aspect of being trapped. Oh my gosh, I could give you a whole, what things trap you, Kevin? I can give you a whole list. It's way too many things that give me that feeling, even if I know better, that give me that feeling to say, gosh, here I am. And, somebody's going to say, oh, he's a consummate, entrepreneur. He was, born to work for himself. Maybe not. Maybe it's just the best fit for my unattended attachment style. Play with that.
So I love this. I love the philosophical side to it. I really appreciate these kinds of conversations. I think just like with anything out of, so I could say, for example, that having gone through a lot of being parentified and dealing with big emotional things at a young age, that like the beauty of that for me was like, I like to go deep. I like to understand people. I really have a lot of empathy and compassion for people. I think we can sit down, and I think that it's very authentic and truthful to say there's not exclusively negatives to anybody's attachment style. There are superpowers that are born from different challenges that we're faced with as well, yeah. Right? Like a lot of dismissive avoidants are also very like thoughtful, thorough, practical, very intelligent. Because if you're not focusing as much on your emotional facility, like your emotions all the time, and letting that be the focal point of your life, then you tend to be really focused on the intellectual pillars of life. So there's so many benefits for each. You look at the anxious attachment styles, mm-hmm. They tend to be extremely thoughtful, sweet, good at connecting and bonding with people, very charismatic, very charming, very friendly. Like each one has their own superpowers that come out of a lot of these things. And I think that the way, because you could apply that to like so many aspects of life, I think the way to look at it is like, there are things that we feel good about, that we appreciate about our lives, that we like, that are born out of sometimes conflict or trauma or challenges. Those we want to hang on to. We're trying to keep those. If we like them, that means they're working for us.
Yeah.
But the things that we want to change are the fears, the times that we're triggered, the times that we know we're having thoughts or ruminating about things that don't feel good, we're dysregulated. All the root causes of those things we're trying to abolish. All the things that we like about ourselves, that are meeting our needs, that are showing up well for us, even if they're born of or connected back to adaptations we made because of early attachment trauma. These things are still, if they're working for us and they feel good, they're our truth, right? Our feelings are letting us know that we're in alignment and that we're in truth there. It's all the times we make decisions from fear or triggering or shut down or all those different places that we want to evolve out of.
I do appreciate the superpower aspect. It'd be like in a wartime, and okay, we need somebody to steer the ship and not be distracted by all the chaos, whatever. Let's get a dismissive avoidant. They'll be great at that.
Totally.
Over here, we need somebody over here who's tending to people's needs and is actually empathizing. Let's get somebody anxious over there. Exactly. Am I tracking? So there's the good part. But now as we come together again with the concept or if it was a couple, an expectation that they're both working towards a secure attachment, they're never going to be perfect. They're still going to have certain triggers. The point, but what you're saying is it doesn't matter what they are. It just matters that we have them out on the table and that we figure out a way to advocate for each other within those, even as we're working to strengthen them. Fair?
I would say that there's a really important part of reprogramming the wounds. Like I want to highlight that because it's so important. Like we need to know if your triggers are to feel unloved or trapped or these different things, and somebody you're in a loving relationship with, their triggers are to feel abandoned. We want to reprogram the core wounds. We want those wounds to not be taking up so much space in the relationship by using auto-suggestion, that belief reprogramming tool for the 21 days, so that we can actually abolish those triggers. That's a big part. But then after that, it's like, know our needs, communicate those needs to each other. If I know that you need space and independence and freedom and acceptance, and you are sensitive to criticism, for example, and we're in a relationship together, I'm going to be mindful about that. I'm going to make sure that when I'm communicating to you, my husband's dismissive avoidant historically. And, I knew as we were doing the work on our relationship that, hey, I want to be mindful about how I give feedback and be respectful that that's a sensitivity and care about that, and just like for me, as a fearful avoidant, I would feel very sensitive to being dismissed sometimes, right? Like if that sort of dismissiveness was there, that didn't feel good for me. I would feel like not important, or that was the big core wound for me, or or fear of abandonment as well. So, I could talk about those things. So we want to reprogram the core wounds so that they're not there, but we also want to know each other's needs, things that matter to each other, so we can hold space for them, for one another, right? I know that my husband needs, even though he's become so much more securely attached, I know that he also needs his time alone. And so I make sure that that's going to happen in our relationship and in our life. And for me, although it may be out of his comfort zone as a fearful avoidant, I tend to need a lot of novelty. I want to try new things and go to a new place. And for him, like, he makes space to do that with me, to go on a trip or to try a different place so when you know what each other really needs and like what really fills you up, that's where you can sort of pour into those things at the same time and get good at communicating on behalf of them. And when we have good communication, when we don't have all these core wounds, when we know how to meet our own needs and each other's needs, we end up in a really successful relationship where it's not just like you're in it and it's successful because you're staying in it, but you're actually happy and fulfilled and thriving in the relationship.
So in that, if we use you and your husband, for instance, with him being a dismissive avoidant, would you say, like one of the things you talked about, which is true for me, criticism's difficult.
Yeah.
But you would look at it and go, okay, but it's also a part of relationship. There is a place for that. But understanding your, again, propensity, your style here, there are some guidelines that will help him embrace it more, engage with it more. And I assume that's going to be for all of us. For all of us, we're going to, here's how we perceive conflict. Here's how we perceive criticism. Here's how we perceive attention. Here's how we perceive intimacy, vulnerability, whatever. So we understand that in each style, but, especially with a couple, we need to understand, or we would be best to understand that. And then with that, figure out, okay, here are some, what would you call it, Taies? Some guidelines, some structure that will help these things happen in a more healthy, acceptable way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we each did like core wound reprogramming, right? So like his assumption that if he's being criticized means he's defective, he did work on, right? And belief reprogramming on, which already made him have a way easier time about those things. But then at the same time, as I knew that was a historical sort of sensitivity for him, as he was doing that work, I knew that rather than saying, you don't spend enough time or whatever it might be, I would say, hey, I miss you. I feel like we've been really busy this week. Let's plan a fun date night this weekend. So instead of saying, you don't do this, I would say, hey, I want some of this, and communicate in the positive, right? And so be sensitive to that kind of thing. Or if I had to give really hard feedback because I was like hurt by something or something really landed badly, I would start by saying things I appreciated about the relationship. Like, hey, I appreciate this and this. I know you weren't coming from a bad place, but for me, this thing really didn't land well. That hurt. That didn't feel good. Here's what I need instead. Can we work on this? And so by framing in a way that was comfortable, what's actually really interesting, we've been together for about 10 years now. And what's really interesting is I noticed that like, I don't have to do that anymore. I don't even have to like worry about it. And I'm more direct with things. And I think that sort of sensitivity is mostly gone. Like, I don't think anybody's like, yay, criticism. But right. I think that over time you get repetition and emotion of a new way of communicating. And that core wound isn't being reinforced all the time. And that ends up shifting for somebody altogether. And for me, I can absolutely say the same thing. I used to have a lot of sensitivities as well that over time, I don't feel as sensitive to as I look back, 6 years ago, 8 years ago. And I'm like, oh, those things used to really land poorly for me.
It's, again, I'm so interested, Taies, in how this, again, back to my initial question, how this drives us. How is this driving us? And we look at, I often go through with guests kind of these key areas of life, and what drives you. I also kind of want to know what drives us in general. If you take a topic like, let's take spirituality, which we started off and you talked about, that's a big interest of yours, as it is mine. And I'm now looking at it and going, I wonder how my attachment style drives me spiritually. Like, what if we looked at it? Can you do that? Can you look at it and go, okay, as a dismissive avoidant, you may experience, X, Y, Z as you look at spirituality.
Totally. I've
Yeah.
noticed this
Tell
so
me.
much. Okay, so this is actually so funny. I've never had this conversation with anybody, but I would see this all the time in client practice when I worked with clients, and I'd always think about it. Um, Dismissive avoidants are usually, okay, so this is a pattern. I'm not saying this is everybody, but it is a very emerging pattern, are really into like things related to non-attachment, which is so funny. So things about not being attached to anything, which are really speaking into like the freedom, the independence, the
Well, we started off this. I'm reading DeMello, and that was the way of love, is not being attached to X.
I swear, and not even joking. When you said that, I was like, oh, I wonder if you're dismissive avoidant because that's your side of things. And listen, like that's like when we look at life, right? There's two sides, and I think Eckhart Tolle says this really well. He says we're a human and a being, right? We have the human side, the needs part, the connection part. We're here. We need each other. We have a humanity side, but we have the being part, the spiritual part, and if you're overly attached and you're in codependency, then being able to harness from a spiritual perspective, not attachment styles, but healthy non-attachment from like a sort of Zen Buddhist perspective, for example, is very meaningful, very healing work. You're building the sense of connection to something besides just everybody in your external life, but a connection to self, a connection to God, to a higher power. So that's really powerful. On the flip side of that, what's so interesting is anxiously attached individuals in their own spiritual seeking tend to be very connected to the idea of oneness, of unconditional love spiritually. And again, that's a beautiful thing. That's a very healing thing. But I think we want to look at ourselves like as a holistic person, because if we're constantly like, if somebody's already anxiously attached, they're already kind of more codependent. So what I would see, for example, a lot of times with anxious attachment styles is they get into codependency and they think of like oneness and they're like, oh, I have to be selfless because we're all connected. And they fall into this trap. And I'll actually speak from my own experience here because this happened to me. So I was really into spirituality, started a client practice really young. I, as a fearful avoidant who has that anxious leaning side, was already poor with my boundaries. So I would just overgive to people and under receive. And I would do that. When I got into spirituality, it was very healing from the non-attachment side. I learned a lot about not attaching to things and meditation and a lot of emotional regulation stuff. But I also was like, oh, we are all one. I'm going to keep sacrificing. Well, I found myself 4 years into client practice, seeing people at ridiculous hours of the day, all day, every day. And I found myself experiencing physical health stuff, like very early, like nothing too serious or severe, but definitely some like, just challenges and that I had to work through. And so in terms of just like gut health and inflammation and just things that were, my body was out of whack. And so it was so interesting because I realized like, oh, this sort of more anxious side of me thinks, oh, be self-sacrificing. And it's like, I was so focused on the being part of human being. What about the human? And learning to like have better boundaries, meet my own needs more, request my needs from people and allow them to meet them. Like that was actually very attachment style oriented healing, but it leveled me out in terms of like what side of spirituality I was focused on as well, as like actively receiving and making sure that I could open up and communicate in that sort of vulnerable space and sense, and getting more into the healthy non-attachment things and not, attaching to outcomes or expectations from people. So it's very interesting because I do find that like our attachment style does tend to filter our relationship to spirituality, which I think if we're too polarized can actually kind of activate these deeper core wounds that we have and put us into a more challenging spot. If I'm already self-sacrificing, I believe in oneness, I just self-sacrifice more instead of coming up the other side and taking myself better into consideration.
It's completely interesting because if you looked at, I don't know if we can fairly say, if we could say, here's some tenets of spirituality, of healthy spirituality or relationships or whatever. And like you saying, okay, if we look at attachment, again, back to, Anthony DeMello, which we've both been reading his book, The Way to Love, which is so much about not being, you can desire whatever, that's fine. But if you're attached to it for your well-being, well, I read that and I'm like, yes, I'm totally good with that. Love it. Now over here, if we talk about, okay, another aspect of spirituality is vulnerability. Yeah, I don't really speak that language. That doesn't, and yet I know I would imagine like an anxious attachment would go, yeah, there we go. I'm all Brene Brown all the way. Let's talk about vulnerability, but it's going to be these again predispositions that I assume you would say go into everything. I mean, can we take gosh, a propensity for in health and wellness. Okay. Just the pursuit of health and wellness. Are you going to say, yeah, dismissive avoidance, they'll tend to gravitate this way. And you're already not what? Tell me.
It's so funny. I never thought about this before, but I was fearful avoidant. Fearful avoidants are very all or nothing. I played soccer in university growing up, so I trained a lot, and I like it's just so funny. We're self-reflecting. That's why I was shaking my head because I was going, "Oh my gosh!" Like for me, I would just run myself into the ground, like just run myself very all or nothing. If I didn't want to be doing something, I wasn't going to show up very much at all, but I would push in such an extreme and kind of unhealthy way, which is very very synonymous with what a fearful avoidant would do. So that's why I was shaking my head going, oh my goodness, absolutely that rings true.
That's just so interesting. Again, to look at it and go, okay, here's my attachment style. It is going to influence every aspect of my life and my relationships. Well, let's go there. Because now I'm coming back to my best friend. He's a doc, and he would say, well, you have a relationship with everything. You have a relationship, Kevin, with food. You have a relationship with health and wellness. You have a relationship with everything. You have a relationship with automobiles. I mean, we all have a perspective, and so if we're saying, okay, this is my attachment style, of course, then it is going to influence
Yes.
every relationship I have, which I have a relationship. I mean, that is life. Life is a relationship with everything. So understanding this, because that's what I find myself thinking right now as we're talking is, holy smokes. Okay. So as a dismissive avoid, this is going to be my propensity. No wonder I like this and I don't like that. And if I don't, or you would say that I'm saying like, that I'm okay with that, but that I have fear of. Is that where you would say it? Is focus on the
Totally.
fear? Okay.
100%. And it's because your attachment style is first and foremost the relationship you have to yourself. What are my core wounds? What are my unmet needs? What are my emotional patterns? So what are my boundaries, the way I communicate, my behaviors? So these 6 things make your attachment style essentially. And so because that's a relationship to yourself, even as you're speaking, it's so interesting to chat about this because I was thinking everything like, when I look at how I struggled with opiates, it was like all or nothing. So intently, which are very like fearful avoidant patterns. I look at the relationship to even like work, at least in the past, it's like all or nothing, like all in, very intense. And so you'll see, yeah, it shows up in all areas of our lives. And I think it's exactly to what your best friend says, which is because everything is a relationship. And ultimately that's being dictated by the relationship we have to ourselves first.
Okay. Well, I want to use, so I'm going to pick on you since you're the guest. That if we look at some of those real quick and say, okay, spirituality so would you say that, okay, something drove you there early on. Mm-hmm. Now bring yourself to today that has the drive in your spirituality. Has it changed, and has it changed in regard to your pursuit of secure attachment?
Yes. A lot of it has changed, which is so interesting too. So when I started this path, I was very all or nothing, very extreme. That's a very fearful avoidant thing to be. Like everything, whatever it was that I was dedicating to was at the highest intensity. And if it wasn't in my realm of what I'm dedicating wholeheartedly at 120% to, it doesn't exist to me. Like it's just outside of that. And that's it. And that's and what's so interesting about where this comes from is like fearful avoidance. They say the more trauma you're exposed to, the more likely you are to have something called a cognitive distortion of all or nothing thinking. Well, if you're thinking in all or nothing ways all the time, then you're feeling all or nothing feelings. And then, of course, your actions, going back to that BTEA thing we talked about, they're going to follow that. And so for me, I could absolutely see that in myself. And in a lot of ways, I have to say that really benefited me in like my journey to sobriety, because at the beginning of I'm going to not use opiates anymore and I'm instead going to try to get sober, I almost like kind of monkey barred from one addiction to another, which actually became from like opiates to spirituality and being like on a
Yeah.
quest to like, I actually thought that I was on like an enlightenment quest for a long time. And I was learning everything I could all the time and meditating for hours a day. And I think that saved me. But over time, as I became more secure and had less core wounds and learned how to meet my own needs and was more emotionally regulated, I'm much less of an all or nothing person. So I have a lot more space and bandwidth and balance to move into things in less of a way that's like so dramatic. Even little things, like it's funny, sometimes it'd be like, oh, I'm eating keto or like eating really clean. And then it's like day 11 and I ate a muffin for breakfast because I forgot to eat on the way out the door and whatever. Oh, well, who cares now? I'm just going to eat whatever I want all day. Who cares? Whereas like even that I noticed has shifted for me. Like if I don't eat in a way that I planned, it's like, okay, that's going to happen. And I just return to my next meal of eating how I planned. And so it's less of those like extremes and more of like I can sort of move steadily towards an overarching goal or commitment that I've made, which I definitely find is more productive.
As an analogy, just thinking about spirituality, could that relate to early on, all or nothing? So you're going to go after a specific bent of spirituality or religion even. And then over here, as you have become more securely attached, you're able to open yourself up to some other ideas and thoughts. Is that
absolutely
fair?
Absolutely that. And even little things, like the first thing that comes to mind is I would have these like, oh, I'm going to do an evening routine. So I'm really into like A Course in Miracles. It's like they have these daily lessons, and that's been a thing that I've loved for many years now. And I used to like skip a day and be like, oh, I have to start from day one and like very extreme.
Right.
And I know I missed a day. I have to start from the beginning. And I'd be on day like 80 or something. And these funny things where I would trip myself up because I was so like extreme in the way I thought I had to do things or in the way I would, immerse myself in things. Whereas now, like I missed a day or two, I just return to lesson 289 or whatever I'm on today. Like, and there's not, the reason was because I would beat myself up and hold myself to such extreme standards because as a fearful avoidant with a lot of core wounds, it was like, I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. So that's messing with how my relationship is to what I'm doing. Right. But when I have those core wounds aren't there, I don't feel like, oh, I'm bad if I'm making a mistake, or I'm not good enough if I'm not doing it perfectly. So instead, I have like a lot of grace for stuff, a lot of like room to be okay with mistakes and to show up and just to continue on the path. And so I would say it's not so much like the spiritual practices I have. I would say it's my consistency with the practices themselves and my relationship to how I feel about what I'm doing. I'm not critical of them or restarting things or things like that, which is in turn changing that dynamic.
Okay, well then as a fearful avoidant, could that cause you to be all or nothing prone? Does it also cause you to not go after some things because you are all or nothing? And so if you look at it and go, holy smoke, so if I'm going to go after that and be all or nothing, I'm just not going to do it. Can it just keep you from trying at all?
100%. I think that that's a huge part of fearful avoidant. Like, it's funny because, I've been secure for quite a while now, and that doesn't mean I'm a perfect robot or anything, but definitely like do not have the chaos I had on a daily basis as fearful avoidant. But I think what I would see when I look before is that I had really bad staying power. So I would invest so much into things, push so hard. And then if I felt like frustrated or, even like jobs I was in, like if I felt like I wasn't appreciated or my hard work was being taken advantage of, or I didn't have boundaries, I was staying so late, doing so much, what I would do is I would be like, I'm out of here. That's it. This isn't working for me. I poured myself into it. Now I'm leaving because it's not working for me. Rather than, I've been in the same field now for 10 years or 12 years, and I've had staying power in a much more effortless way. But I know that's because my relationship to things is like, if something's not working for me, I go communicate about it. I don't have all these core wounds around it. I'll set a boundary if something's not going well for me this time around. So because I have those different skills in a different way, I'm not getting to the part of being nothing. So I was very all in, but then I was able to maintain that in a more balanced way over time without sabotaging from that like rebellious sort of fearful avoidant
Yeah.
nature that was in me, or nurture that was in me from past experiences.
But you said a couple of things that got me thinking about just health and wellness, and especially as things that we want to, commit to and change and whatnot. Health and wellness is always there. And I'm thinking that you probably tune in when you see, let's say, unchecked. So unchecked attachment styles. And you see this person over here who is the ultra endurance athlete, addicted to fitness kind of thing. Then you see this person who is, 500 pounds, morbidly, obese. Then there's this person over here who's doing the yo-yo diet and the next fad and whatever. Can you look at those and to some degree sense, yeah, that's probably happening from that type of attachment style, that type of attachment style, and that one?
That's super interesting. So I would say all or nothing, yo-yo diet, next fad, that sounds very fearful avoidant to me. And in client practice, I would see a lot more of that with fearful avoidance. I actually, as I'm running through thinking about it, I'm like, I don't think I ever had a client who did that all the time who wasn't a fearful avoidant.
Interesting.
But what I would say is like overweight or endurance athlete, I would say that you can arrive there as any attachment style. And here's why.
Okay.
Endurance athlete, you could see as fearful avoidant for the sense that they tend to push, but they may not be as like long-term committed, right? So it depends how your snapshot in time. Are they an endurance athlete for 10 years, or are they an endurance athlete and they're really pushing for 6 months and they're about to sabotage 3 months away from now and move on to the next thing, right? But dismissive avoidants are really good at removing the kind of like repressing their emotional pain and just getting purely into a space where they can just push themselves through things. But also dismissive avoidants are often prone to creature comforts. So dismissive avoidants are poor self-soothers, even though they tend to try to be the ones that self-soothe. They're not really self-soothing. They're like self-numbing more. And so sometimes the self-soothing or self-numbing is happening through work or through obsessive hobbies, but a lot of times it can also be through alcohol or through drugs or through food and binge eating food a lot of the time. So
you're talking to me, and I'd say all of those. Anything. I can medicate. I can give you a whole list of medications, whether it is working out, running, riding, endurance stuff, or it's food, or it's I got a whole list of beverages from coffee to tea to wine. I mean, I have rituals around all. And so I look at that. I've always attributed that kind of the Enneagram type thing, which I come off as a 7, which is I'm just looking for the next celebration. I'm looking for the next pleasure. I'm looking for the next, whatever. Though I also have, and I was wondering about, the dismissive avoidant that I've been a lifetime athlete. I mean, I still do elite, sports. It's very much you said I can get into flow. Well, actually, help me on this, because on one hand, I'd say that is my flow, man, to get out on a mountain bike trail or a running trail, and I can go into flow. But I also do it to medicate. So if I'm struggling emotionally, I'm also doing it I'm just trying to shut it out. And I may go extra hard just so I can't feel anything.
Yes, totally. And that's like a very like well-known dismissive avoidant practice, right? You'll see generally, though not always, anxious attachment styles can soothe more through like they try to soothe through people. They get addicted to people and having people around and never want to be alone.
I would never choose a person to soothe through. I'm the opposite of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels so like counterintuitive. And part of it honestly is because, I used to have clients who come in and I had one client, she was anxiously attached. Her husband was dismissive avoidant. She was like, I remember, and it's like tongue in cheek, but I remember she was like, they were in their power struggle phase of a relationship. So we have these different stages of relationships, which they were in the power struggle, which is statistically where people often break up in. And she was like, my husband loves his boat more than he loves me. And she was like so serious about it. And what I was trying to explain to her is exactly what you said, which is like, well, if you take a child, they don't get soothing from parents and attunement from parents as a means of emotionally regulating the way that they need. They don't soothe through people. They soothe through things. That's what you learned as a kid, So you learn to soothe through whatever you did as a kid that helped you deal with your emotions, whether that was a hobby or a sport or, and instead of soothing through friends or parents or groups of people. And so, of course, there's this, you can observe that somebody loves their work more. That's not the case, or the boat or whatever it might be. But it's just a representation of how somebody has learned to soothe and what feels most comfortable.
That's so interesting because you tend to think, introvert, extrovert, this personality style, this, and now to come to attachment. And I'm sitting here questioning because to self-soothe, what do I want most? Isolation, seclusion, solitude. I get giddy about that. Have I ever gotten, this is a hard thing to admit, honestly, Taies. I don't know that I've ever gotten as giddy about being with somebody as I do about being with nobody.
Yeah. And that's a representation of like where that comfort zone is, where that familiarity is, right? What feels, because our subconscious mind, like when you just break it down mechanically, your subconscious mind wants familiarity. It wants its comfort zone. That's what it associates as safety. So it's like, obviously, if that's your conditioning, that's where you're going to go to and be appreciative of that. And part of that can be really beautiful because we can develop a really great relationship to ourselves, and that can be amazing. And then it's like, if there's a part of it where we go, okay, well, I'd like to be able to feel as much of that, then really it's just reprogramming fears that are blocking you from feeling as comfortable around a deep attachment or connection as you would in relationship to self, so that you can easily at any point lean on both.
As people are hearing this, and somebody right now is driving down the interstate and they're listening to this, or they're in a traffic jam, or they're on a run and they're going, okay, holy smokes, how do obviously, go take the quiz to show yourself that. But at some degree, I'm looking at it from an overall standpoint of going, man, I most often want a way to, I don't know if measure is the word, but I want a fear regulator. I need a little app on my phone, and that anytime I start to feel a fear, I want it to red flag and go, where is that coming? Look at my attachment style. Where is that? Okay, that makes sense. But that's where I'm going. That's obvious. Would you say ultimately that's what we're rooting out? Go from an unhealthy attachment style to secure is we're rooting out fear. Is that too simplistic?
Exactly. I love that as a simplistic way of saying it, because then you're moving from truth. You can still have your needs. You can still appreciate time alone, independence, autonomy, those superpowers of your personality that make you an entrepreneur, that make you, we can still appreciate and want those things, but all the things that are moving, that are motivated by, for lack of a better word, some form of dysfunction, right? Like some form of fear or limiting belief or things like that. That's what we're getting out of the way. And then you get the beautiful parts of your personality without the motivated by fear parts. And it's interesting because when you say, the connection, right? You say like, okay, sometimes I value much more the time alone than time with somebody else. Well, we can look at like from an attachment point of view, there's something called codependency, which is most people are familiar with. It's like, I'm just going to meet all of your needs. You meet all of mine. We're not going to meet our own.
We had Melanie Beattie on the show. So yeah.
So you understand a lot. Exactly. And so we have the codependency. Then we have the super opposite end of the spectrum, which can be more dismissive, avoidant at times, which is counterdependency, which is we can actually not want people to rely on us because we're afraid of having that responsibility or infringement of freedom, which can make us in a position where we're constantly kind of like buffering people away. And then we have healthy interdependency, which is like, I am a master at meeting my own needs and self-soothing and relying on myself. And I fully trust myself to know what those needs are and to be able to do that. And I'm also a master at communicating my needs to others and allowing myself to be open enough to rely on someone else and vulnerable enough to feel comfortable doing that and know that I can lean on close, trusted people in my life if I were to go through a difficult time. And so that is interdependency, where we have mastery of both. And there's going to be appropriate places and situations where each emerges, right? Like, for example, God forbid, but if like my husband lost a family member in his life, and he's going to go through a season of life where he's not going to be as available because he's going to be going through grief and different difficult times. And so I would be able to say, okay, I'm going to lean less on him. I'm going to let him lean more on me during this period. And I'll lean on myself more. I'll lean on other trusted friends or family members for my needs or things like that. And I can carve out that space. But if there's a time where I really need somebody and I'm the one in the hot seat or going through something difficult, I want to know that I can be vulnerable enough to not have to suffer in silence or suffer in isolation, that I can meet my own needs and do that, but that I can also open and receive from people at the same time.
I've mentioned some of the other profile, Enneagram and DISC and human design, and there's so many others. Shoot, I should have asked it a different way. I was going to try to ask a way diplomatically to say, are there any that stand out that you're kind of a fan of, or you feel value in?
Any of those things?
Yeah. Any other so here we've got, we're talking about, I'm fishing for a question I'm going to follow up with. So we've got attachment theory. Here, are there some others along those lines that you go, gosh, yeah, I find value in understanding people's propensities through these other resources too?
All of them. I love all of it. I mean, I'm big, okay. So I'm big on like the MBTI. So, okay. Like I'm an INFJ, for example. And so I recharge in an introverted way. I know I seem very extroverted, but INFJs often seem extroverted because they like people, and then intuitive, feeling based, and judging, which is like more of the planner.
Yeah.
I love that. It helps me. It's funny because even though I knew my husband's attachment style, for example, he's an INTP. And so we're very compatible in how we recharge. We actually both need a little bit of time alone. Mm-hmm. We both live in our heads. We're less sensitive to like material things. He's very thinking based. I'm more feeling based. And then he's a P. So he's more go with the flow. And I'm like a planner. And actually, even though I knew so much about attachment styles, P's that stands for perceiving. They tend to like not like to plan ahead as much because they're like, I don't know how I'm going to feel when I arrive at that place. Whereas for me, like I love planning. Like even if the plan changes many times, I like that plan. So I think that there's so much value in just understanding those dynamics of like, oh, you're not planning because that's not how you function. It's not a lack of care, which is what I interpreted that as around things at times. I think that's amazing. I love the Enneagram. I think that that's a meaningful way of understanding people as well. And then I'm actually not as familiar with human design. I've just been looking into it more recently. I booked like a human design appointment to learn about it. I thought it sounded exciting. So I think there's value in all of these things. I think there's so much value and insight into all the ways and all the angles through which we can understand ourselves. And I would say what like integrated attachment theory is, and like this body of work is a systematic way to heal, to become securely attached. It doesn't mean that that's going to give you all the insights into yourself as a person from all different angles. I think there's so many things we can learn from other areas. I just find this to be a really good methodical system for like, here's what's not working. Here are the fears. Here's the dysfunction. Here's how we can become secure.
Well, I obviously too. That's why you're here. It's on the human design. So that's new within the past year. And I did not want to give it any credit because of my own biases, but we had Erin Claire Jones on the show. And we could talk about that another time. But okay, so here's what I'm fishing for, because I feel like so often with these, I had a client one time, it was a long time ago, and they had me take, it was a company that hired me to do some stuff, and they had me take a profile. I can't remember what it was. Anyways, the guy at some point, we're having dinner, and he goes, so I hear you talk about doing woodwork and stuff. He says, that just doesn't fit your profile. Sorry, I don't know what to tell you. And that's what kind of got me on the bent of, nobody's a thoroughbred anything. And we have so many things. I would love somebody, everybody, programmers out there, listen, I'd love to have somebody take all these things from attachment to the Enneagram, to human design, to DISC, take them all and figure out some way to meld them together so we can spit it out and with something different, or with something that, makes sense. Because I don't know that I've heard, Taies, counterdependency. I don't know that I've heard that. How did I miss that? Codependent, yes, for sure. And, interdependent and whatnot. But counter, I think at heart, I tend to be that. I would rather nobody rely on me. You do your thing, I do my thing. But, and this is what I was fishing, I'll come around circle, but I have also suffered I was going to say in my family, but I've done it in business too. Whether it's a business partner, a spouse, my kids, I have also suffered from what I've referred to as the hero complex, even with clients. I burnt myself out at one point on consulting and coaching because I took so much responsibility. And I want to be known as I fix everything. So, a kid whispers a need and I'm on it, man. I'm out there fixing the car, fixing whatever, trying to be Superman, God, hero, whatever. And I'm thinking, why is that? Because I think at the heart, I don't really want to be relied on for anything. So fix me with that one.
Okay, so
That's literally what I'm looking at going, gosh, because we're all going to hear these things and go, okay, but oh my gosh, I violate that one. How does that fit?
So I love that. I think it's so interesting. I think that there's two parts to it. So the first part is that if I am somebody who is relied on as like the overarching theme, I get relied on by people, then people have that expectation from me. And then if people are always expecting that from me in a specific way, then I'm like allowing them to rely on me. That could potentially trample on my freedom, my independence, my autonomy, those things like that. The second part, so it violates the needs and we can feel trapped. So it violates the needs and hits the core wounds, right? So from an attachment theory point of view, that really tends to sort of show the roots, right? Like what are the biggest roots? Well, if you didn't have a core wound of feeling trapped and you felt you could still communicate your needs for freedom and say, hey, you know what, I'm busy right now, or things like that, then you probably would have a different relationship to it as from the counterdependency point of view. The other part, which is so interesting, is dismissive avoidance and people leaning avoidance. So I struggled with this as well as the prior fearful avoidant struggle to do something called co-regulate. So co-regulation sort of goes hand in hand with interdependency, which means that I can show up and allow, let's say you and I are friends and we walk into this, you walk into the room and let's say we see each other all the time and you walk into the room and I notice right away, oh, Kevin's off today, right? I see that you're kind of somber, you're having a tough day. Co-regulation would be that I'm attuned enough to you to notice that, but then I'm also willing to modify my behaviors to try to help soothe you. So I might sit down, say, hey, how are you? Is everything okay? Is there anything you need from me? I might give you a hug. I might, if I can tell that you need time alone, naturally notice that, know that about you, and then protect your space and be mindful of it. I'm willing to adapt how I show up to help regulate with you. The other part of co-regulation is that you are allowing to receive it. So the flip side of it is that if I'm you and you're me and I walk into the room and I'm somber, that I'm willing to be vulnerable enough about how I'm feeling or what I'm needing and allow you to adapt your behavior to help soothe me. And what I found is that people who are more avoidant leaning, specifically dismissive avoidance dominantly, they are afraid a little bit of both. They're afraid to have the responsibility of feeling trapped, to have to modify their behavior, but they're also actually afraid to be vulnerable enough to allow somebody to see that they're having a hard time or that they're in pain. And they are basically blocked. They block themselves subconsciously from receiving co-regulation. So they won't say, hey, honey, I need space today. I need a little extra time alone. I'm having a hard time. They'll just kind of distance themselves. Or they won't say, hey, when you communicated a few moments ago, I took that to heart. Like, can you try to be less critical and more mindful about that? They won't be vulnerable enough to say those things. So they don't feel comfortable or safe relying on people a lot of the time. And so that's kind of the dismissive avoidant version of it. And fearful avoidance are one-sided. So, for me, I wouldn't receive. Like, I was scared to let people in and allow them to see that I was in pain as well and work to co-regulate. But I was really good at attuning to others. So inevitably you attune to others and try to modify yourself to soothe them until you burn out because it's not a two-way street. But I think really that part is like, if you show up and you're the fixer, that's of your own accord. That's things that you're comfortable doing. But if there's an actual theme of co-regulation where you let people in, you're vulnerable with them, you share what you truly need, you let yourself get seen deeply, and you allow people to have an expectation of you that you'll show up, even if it's imperfect, but the majority of the time, I think those things can feel a little too trapping and a little too vulnerable.
I mean, I overall, Taies, I feel like with this, that as I will continue studying this and working it out, that I want to, obviously, so here I am again, back to the individual. I'm pursuing secure attachment so that I am, in essence, again, nobody's going to be perfect, like you said, but I'm in essence I'm good no matter what. I mean, that would be enlightenment, utopia, holy grail, whatever you want to call it, right? Okay, but I'm not perfect. And so if we're going to mesh, if you and I, Taies, are going to go into business together, I would imagine you'd say, hey, let's get the attachment styles out on the table. So we kind of, just like you would, an Enneagram, whatever. Let's get to know each other and know what are those issues that could be issues. Let's find out what your triggers are, your soft spots, your weak areas, where you're prone to fear, so that we can let's do it on both sides so that we can advocate the best that we can. Again, you're not responsible for me. I'm responsible for myself, and I'm seeking secure attachment. But to give ourselves the best chance at coming together, if we're going to come together, whether that's a romantic relationship, a business relationship, good friends, whatever, to get this out on the table and say, okay, this is probably going to happen. How can we best do this to serve both of us?
Totally. So the first thing is I would want to know your sensitivities, aka your core wounds, right? So if I know, you take criticism to heart a little bit, I would be mindful of that. Like I would want to know that I'm not going to say something off the cuff or too directly, and then it's going to affect you for a few days, and then you're going to pull back, and then we can't communicate in the partnership. Like that would be a big thing. So I'd want to know, what are your big core wounds? If I know you feel trapped, I might be like, hey, Kevin, and if I need you to help me work on a project, I wouldn't be like, Kevin, from 5 till 6, you better be working on that project.
Don't do that. Tell me the result that you want and leave me to myself. Yes.
I'd probably say, hey, Kevin, when you have some time, do you think you could help me with this? So that way you're doing it on your own time. I'm asking you, not requiring you. And, I know that that's going to work better in our communication. So I would know the core wounds and sensitivities you have. I'd know how to sort of bypass them. I'd know that you need freedom and autonomy and space, so I can make sure I take those things into consideration. And I would know that you, as a dismissive avoidant, probably struggle to ask for help when you need it. Because there's that sort of, I'll do it all myself, I'll figure it out kind of attitude a lot of the times. And I would probably encourage you like a lot, fairly frequently, if I'm here if you need anything, I'm here if you need anything, so that you would maybe at some point feel comfortable asking for that kind of help or support. It's funny because my business partner is also a dismissive avoidant. So we've gone through these things. For me, on the flip side, let's say, like, I'm trying to think. So I want to do the fearful avoidant version first. Yeah. I definitely still have the needs of the fearful avoidant: depth, novelty, a lot of those like huge components that are there. But if I was wounded, if I was a true wounded fearful avoidant, as I was, you probably wouldn't want to have a business partnership with me at that time, because I was a very fearful avoidant. It'd probably be very difficult to work with. But in theory, right, that side of things would be, I also could feel trapped very easily, also need freedom. So that would actually probably be quite complementary, because we both have that avoidant side. And then there would definitely be the part of, if you're not communicating at all, it would probably take that to heart from like the abandoned side, like, hey, we need to communicate. That would be really important. I would have had some big fears around trust. And so for me, it's funny because I'm actually still like this a little bit. I can become like a tiny bit, I'm really good at giving trust from the jump. But when somebody's violated trust, even if it's like a contractor and they, maybe fudge some hours or things like that, I can be quite still, like, I really pay a lot of attention to it. And for me, when I am trying to get a conflict resolved, I need context. I need transparency. I don't need to know everything about somebody's life, but I need to know why that happened, what led up to it, and how we're going to prevent that from happening. And if I can see those things and have the transparency and context, and then I can have a solution to prevent it in the future, I can rest assured again. And that's a big part of how I work out conflict. But it's funny because that has roots in fearful avoidant attachment style, because I struggled so much to trust, and so much of how we rebuild trust is consistency, communication, transparency, and context for things.
Well, you bring up something then that even in, here's my propensities, okay? And some of them may have to do with fear. So you mentioned help, like seeking help. And let's say that, well, I'll ask you, as the dismissive avoidant, and I'm not prone to, let's say, and I'm completely off the scales, unhealthy, I would not ask for help out of what fear? What would that
Fear of being
out of?
vulnerable, fear of being seen as like something's wrong with you, or fear of being weak are usually the big ones that show up for
Okay.
just
Okay.
like,
So now let's say over here, in a perfect world, I come over here and I'm perfectly attached. I'm securely attached. I'm all good. I no longer have fear around help, but I could still very much not have a propensity to ask for help. Fair?
yes. And that's where, because you've reprogrammed the fear core wound, you still may have this like way that you're comfortable operating. But that's where it's so valuable to know each other's attachment styles, because then if I say to Kevin, when Kevin has these core wounds still alive, Kevin, you need to ask for help more. You're probably just going to feel resistance and kind of push it away. Versus if you do a lot of the core wound reprogramming, you also have context about your own patterns as having some dismissive avoidant in your attachment style. You might, when I say, hey, Kevin, I noticed that you're overwhelmed lately. I know you're taking on a lot. I need you to ask me for help. This is a good time to like rely on me. I'm here for you. Now, because you understand it, you don't have core wounds motivating your decisions, and you realize, hey, there might be benefit in it. There can be a lot of huge things that come out of that when you're able to actually be vulnerable enough to ask for that support, and really a lot of growth can happen. It honestly reminds me of, did you ever read Rich Dad, Poor Dad? And it's like Robert Kiyosaki, and he says the difference, this like was life-changing for me because I had that tendency to avoid relying on other people for help too. Yeah. And I remember reading the difference between somebody who is self-employed versus business owner, like a company owner, is somebody who asks for help and relies on other people and has a team. And I remember reading that, and I was working in client practice at the time, working crazy hours. And I actually wanted to start our school, the personal development school, and actually like go in and put online courses together and have a community and all these things. And I could never do it because I never had time. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is why I'm never getting there, is because I'm unwilling to delegate, to ask for help, to lean on people, to like bring in people and take that risk, because I want to do it all my own way and make sure it's all, properly done. And then I found that in doing that and releasing some of the control, I actually, in working through those fears of that vulnerability, because it is vulnerable to rely on people. It's scary. It's hard. But I found in doing that I actually was able to eventually build our company. And now we have 40 employees. And so you can see the shifts and changes from opening up to that in a sense.
Well, and I would say that as things grow, I've been forced to rely on help, though I'll never forget. I honestly don't know if it was a guest I had on, something I read somewhere, but it was a woman. She owned a business, and she made this statement about collaboration. And she says something to the effect of, I'll paraphrase it. Yeah, of course I need help in my business, but I'm not, but she says, I see it as there's a difference. Some people want to have help in doing the specific tasks that they're doing. Yeah. Come and help me do, we're going to make this pottery mug. Let's both get our hands on it and do it together. And somebody else would collaborate by saying, you know what, how about if you do the pottery thing, I'll work on the website that sells the pottery. And that's a collaboration, but I want to do my thing autonomously. And in this article, she says, I just don't feel bad for that. We're still collaborating, but I want to do my thing. And that's interesting, because I find myself there that I need help now, so I'm not uploading the audio here. I'm not doing the video editing. I'm not doing most of the stuff of this podcast. I'm doing this part, but this part, I don't want any help with. Yeah.
That's so interesting. That actually makes so much sense. But it's funny because if I can say this, like the way I hear it is almost like that part of you. I hear two things. This is how I heard it. The part of you that does want like your autonomy to be untouched and not sacrificed now had a way of reframing the situation to be like, oh, it's fine to collaborate. I can still protect my autonomy. And
Sure.
there was like that sort of workaround. And the other part that's so interesting is I feel like, so this is sort of a different topic of conversation, but we all have subconscious personality needs. And I will say the whole time we're talking, I'm like, oh, I hear like everything you're saying, like you relate to being avoidant, but like avoidants are not this vulnerable about sharing. They're just not, as a general rule. And they're not so open to like receiving feedback and all these different things. And it's interesting because we all have subconscious personality needs that drive our personality. And they're things that we're not trying to be. They're things that are already showing up in our behaviors. And I feel like probably two of your biggest ones are like personal growth and learning. And it's almost like the needs are so strong for you that they outweigh any fears of being vulnerable or asking questions even about yourself that you would otherwise often see for dismissive avoidance, which is a little bit of a rarity. Like you won't see that as often. And I would go back and think that you're probably like 50% avoidant leaning and 50% secure is the way I'm reading this conversation. But maybe you were going back to like your worst moments or in the past.
I was trying to answer it like with no modification, no conscious change, whatnot. It's, what's really interesting that I just thought of as you said that, my pursuit of personal growth, self-improvement, whatever you want to call it, without that, it feels confining. Like, oh crap, then I'm stuck with me.
So like there's no freedom.
If I don't open myself to something else, I'm plateaued. And that scares me. That's fear right there to say I'm done. Like this is all I got. I mean, there's got to be more. I want more. I want more. I want more peace. Yeah. I mean, that's honest. There's not a day that goes by. I want more peace. I want less anxiety. I don't want to be even anxious about stuff I'm excited about. Can I just be and quit doing? So there are things I want to be better for the relationships that I have. I want to do a better job at work. And I feel like, man, my only hope is fixing me. And so I'm going at it, hopefully healthfully, but there's some fear in it too. And just because you mentioned that the dismissive avoidant doesn't want to be confined, when you were just saying that right there, I thought, it feels confining not to.
Interesting. That's really cool though. But those are your programs, and that like your associations are that growth and learning equal freedom, which is very conducive to that need as a dismissive avoidant attachment style. It's so interesting because a lot of times what you'll see instead, and everybody's different, right? Even by your attachment style, but your needs and your relationships can change ever so slightly. I would say the vast majority of dismissive avoidance will be like, looking at myself too deeply feels too vulnerable. So even if I care about freedom and learning, they often try to do it in invulnerable ways. So they want their freedom by having their autonomy, their space, or they want to learn about things that feel safe emotionally to learn about. Whereas for you, like, it's so interesting because you're asking questions, but you're like, oh, I do this. What do you think? And like, I keep being like, I hear the dismissive avoidant because you keep saying, I need the autonomy. I prefer being on my own. Like you're saying all the things that totally go exactly neatly in that category. But there's definitely some other unique parts there. And it sounds like a lot of it's because you're seeing, hey, I care about freedom and growth enough that I'm willing to overcome my own fears of vulnerability in the process.
Well, and going back to taking the quiz, I probably took it with, okay, who's me at my worst? And because, I think you'll relate to this. I mean, I'm sitting here in my studio. I am king of my domain. I'm doing what I enjoy doing. I feel no threat, no whatever. Now, I could change if I went into a business meeting, depending on the dynamics of that. Now I'm not at the healthiest place because there's a threat here. There's a fear there. Same thing if I go home and I'm with, spouse, or I'm trying to get dealing with a teenage kid that I feel insecure with. And now I'm not functioning from secureness. So I feel like I dip into this. I mean, that's probably a relevant topic that we're talking about this, but even as let's just say, can you say that here's your attachment and it's not across the board, back to the spectrum thing. And so you may function more securely in this environment, in this relationship, than with this one. I mean, we know that the consummate thing of, everybody's good until they go home for the holidays. And then it's just, you revert back to your childhood worst or whatever, that this is a continuum.
Absolutely. I think that part of it is also like the environments you're in. So like you said it best, where if I'm in my home and I'm the king of my domain and I have this space here, of course that feels comfortable. It's meeting all of your needs, right? Without threatening any of your core wounds or fears. The goal would be that you have the same sort of comfort level and openness level and you feel just as regulated when you do go home and you're around a group of people, or you are in a business meeting, and that would be the goal. And that would be, okay, reprogram the core wounds, learn to communicate your needs to others and actually receive them so you can regulate with other people too. And like, I think that's a huge part of it, is like, if you are dismissive leaning, then you're going to feel the best in things that provide you with your own space and time and less people interaction, right? That's that avoidant part. If you are anxious, you're going to feel the exact opposite. You're going to feel like being alone and not having anybody to work with or do things with, even introverts, right? We can have an anxiously attached introvert who may be quieter around people, but they still are yearning constantly for that connection.
Yeah.
And so there's this dynamic of like, that component of things is the environment we're in. You would ideally like to see the anxiously attached person be in a space where they can have to work alone and work on their own thing and do work independently, or spend time alone on a Tuesday or Wednesday evening and feel totally regulated and totally comfortable. But what you'll often see instead is the anxious attachment style time alone on Tuesday, Wednesday. They're lonely. They're texting constantly. They're looking for somebody to talk on the phone with. They feel dysregulated in a way that you may see a dismissive avoidant feel extra levels of discomfort in groups of people where there's not that co-regulation happening.
Well, isn't it probably good for us to hear that though, instead of thinking like, oh my, because I think about myself and I think, gosh, I don't want to be Jekyll and Hyde, but maybe I am. There's some schizophrenia of, you go into this environment and I feel pretty secure, and go into another one and go, oh my gosh, I don't now. So I want to get there, but I realize that's the word I think of most is threatening. I feel more threatened. I feel more insecure. So I'm not functioning as securely attached as I do over here. And that's my goal is to, but that's also, can I have some grace for myself that I'm not Jekyll and Hyde?
Yes, absolutely. That's like your patterning that makes sense. That's like your upbringing. Absolutely. And I think grace is super important to have. I'm so curious. So let's say you go home, and let's say you go into a business meeting, and there's a group of people, and you're going to spend 8 hours tomorrow in a large group of people, and you're going to be sharing maybe vulnerable things in a workshop type of way in this larger group of people. When you sit down and you enter into there, what's your worst case scenario? Like, what are you so afraid could actually happen?
Oh, that I'm found lacking. I want to be capable.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah. So that's actually the I am defective core wound. Like, somebody will see that there's something missing or something wrong with me. And it's such a big core wound. And if I were to ask you, how has that potentially limited you across life? When you look back at like all the ways that showed up, what are some costs to that you see?
Not showing up. I just to avoid it if I feel like I'm going to be found lacking. And again, I'm telling you the feeling, even though I can intellectually say I've done it. Back to your thing of evidence. Okay. Make the list of evidence. So I did that. And what happened? I mean, I've often come to that. I'm like, Kevin, especially in a relationship, what are you fearing? Sometimes my fear feels like at a level that I think I'm really going to be decapitated. I really believe that and of course I don't. What's the worst? I think, why on earth? There's no reason, which is why this is so interesting to come back to the attachment, because I look at some of my innate emotions and fears and think there's seemingly no grounds. My parents didn't decapitate me. I wasn't abused. I was taken care of well. I haven't had horrendous, tragedies and stuff. Where did this fear come from? Which is why I'm so interested to go back and go, okay, if this happened, it makes it, because otherwise you just feel like I'm just ridiculous. Right.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because whenever you go into a situation, if it feels uncomfortable, it's like a tool I often share with people. So if anybody listening, if you feel the discomfort and you want to know what the core wound is, you have to ask yourself, what am I making this mean about me? Or what's my worst case scenario I'm afraid will take place? And by finding that, you find the core wound, and then you can go home and take the tool from the reprogramming and plug it in and do reprogramming of that core wound. And I will say, as somebody who's had like all the core wounds as a fearful avoidant, all the abandonment side, all the trapped and powerless and avoidant side core wounds, I've done so much core wound reprogramming, and that was life-changing. My internal dialogue changed, my emotional regulation changed. Like, and I remember I used to walk into like a shopping mall, and all my stories just about like people or things, I say, shopping mall, because I actually had one of the first places I worked at was in a shopping mall area. And I would walk in and all the people, I would just get so stressed about everything. And I noticed years later, I had my office in the Eaton Center in Toronto when I was working with clients. It was like a office space connected to it, and you had to walk through part of it to get there. And I remember being like, oh, wow, I feel peace going into these sort of big groups of people. And I used to recall how much my internal dialogue was just chaos the moment I would go into larger groups, when I still had all these core wounds of like not good enough and everybody's judging me, or just one thing after another. So I do want to encourage like anybody listening who can relate to some of these things, who can relate to, feeling some of the dismissive avoidance side or the fearful avoidance side or the anxious side, and being so panicked when they're, somebody's pulling away and all the fears that come up. Like, anybody can take that exercise that we talked about and like spend that 21 days and just rehash these things. And it really will help release a lot of those wounds and help us move more from truth instead of fear.
Okay, well, I'll ask you this, and we'll put it in the intro to the resources. And I know we have some, we've got a special code for folks, and we'll have that in the intro and whatnot. But where, so for somebody who's been here for 2.25 hours listening, to this, and they're looking at resources. Obviously, we've got the book that I have been using as a resource. You let me into the community, and there are a lot of resources. You have a massive amount of, content. Obviously, you've got so much. And I would say for folks, gosh, a great starting point that I've appreciated is just your Instagram account. Go in there and your YouTube account, both. Go in there and look at the headline that looks interesting. Go do the quiz first off. And again, we'll give everybody resources there, but what are the top highlights for, okay, somebody's just heard this. Where are the first places to plug in?
In terms of just in terms of where to do the healing, or in terms of like courses to take, or just places in general to be?
Just getting the initial 101 on their attachment style, and then where to go towards healing.
Yeah, I would do the quiz. And then if somebody does want to go into the school, you want to do the belief reprogramming course. It's how to reprogram your core wounds. You want to do the needs course, so you can learn your needs and how to communicate your needs. And then you want to do the emotional regulation course. And those are like 3 really good places to start. And then you can always just look at like the 10 signs of your attachment style on YouTube or things like that. But those first 3 courses are designed to help you like literally have all these tools to reprogram, learn to meet your needs, learn how to share them with other people in your life so you can co-regulate and feel like you can soothe with others. And then nervous system regulation, so you can feel more comfortable in your own body and your own skin, etc.
Yeah, that's a big one for me. I function at kind of I feel like there's an inner squirrel that is just, whether it's worry or whether it's just excitement. And I'm so often, go back to like the somatic thing. Box breathing is my best friend now. It's just chill out whenever I drive and realize that my shoulders are up here, and I don't know why. It's just kind of my default for various reasons. And it's to come back there. So, Taies, it's tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's such a gift, such a wealth of knowledge. And but I know that now I've got knowledge. Now I want to go and pursue, for the sake of myself and my own sanity and health and peace, and for the people that I care about. I want to do the workout. So I'll be working out in your content.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Friends, thanks so much for joining us in this show. I hope it opened up a whole world of understanding and opportunity for you. Again, I talked about it at the beginning of the show and during it. You can go to personaldevelopmentschool.com, take the free attachment style quiz. And then if you want to join the membership, get into the courses, you can use code Kevin25 and get 25% off. All right, friends, I really trust that this, again, was impacting to you. You can talk with us further as well in the Drive Tribe community. Really encourage you. It's a joy to talk with people there and go further into these issues. Go to kevinmiller.co and you can find out about the community. And until next time, I hope this episode helped you drive further and enjoy the ride. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey. I look forward to meeting you in the Drive Tribe community for ongoing discussions about each episode. You can subscribe to the Drive Drop newsletter for weekly updates. Find it all at kevinmiller.co, along with all our social media and video clips. Until next time, I hope this episode helps you drive further and enjoy the ride.